Hello and welcome to what is going to be the penultimate session in our series AI Spring, but a very special session on AI and aesthetics. This is part of the Doctoral Consortium initiative that we set up at Digital Futures, and this one has been hosted by FIU DDes. We also have others hosted by Tongji, and we hope to have very soon have some hosted by our different language channels. So before I introduce our distinguished speakers and guests today, let me just quickly make a few announcements. Coming up this week, we have on Friday a session in Spanish on Houdini, and on the 26th, on Saturday, a session that I'll be hosting on Inside Tongji, and of course, following that on the next Sunday, we have another session as part of the DDes. A couple of announcements here. One is that the Digital Futures Conference, the deadline for submission has been extended to the 29th of November. I mentioned this before. This is a really good conference. It doesn't cost you anything to register for this conference, and it's the proceedings are published in Springer. It has high research ratings. I thoroughly recommend it. I'd also want to mention briefly on behalf of FIU are hosting this, that there are a couple of positions, fully funded NSF positions in environmental research, which will allow the candidate to be part of the DDes program for 2 years, and it's fully funded and quite generous. I'll simply mention at the bottom here, there is, if you could do a screen capture of that, you can get this particular one is where the information is. It's in part of the doctoral design program website, and if you're confused by that, please go to email Biana Bogosian, who is looking after these, along with Shaheen Vasik. And these are fully funded, and the deadline is the 1st of December, so not far off. It has to be an American citizen or someone with a green card. Today then, it is our penultimate session. I'm delighted to have Lev Manovich here today, and also Aaron Hertzmann. Weili Zhang is unable to come, but she has sent me a video which will be showing of some of her work. And we really, it's to have Lev and Aaron is a really wonderful combination here present, because they span the two different domains of academia and the commercial world of practice, and also that they span the world of computer science and art. Lev Manovich is a stranger to none of you. I think he is a very significant figure in the world of new media art, possibly the most famous theorist. Originally from Moscow, he came across the States and for some time had established himself at UC San Diego, where he had the cultural analytics group. He's now a professor at City University in New York, where he's continuing to be hugely productive. Aaron Hertzmann is perhaps maybe a little less well known to you because he is a very significant figure in his own right, but less in the academic world. Although he does have a very distinguished academic career, he studied initially for his BA in computer science and art history at Rice University, and then went on to do a PhD in computer science at NYU. He's now the chief research officer for Adobe. So that's a really interesting combination. And I think what we've noticed before is how this domain of AI brings together both the commercial world and the academic world in a very interesting way. Then Weili Zhang is she's initially from Shanghai in China. She took a PhD at UC Santa Barbara and is currently now an assistant professor at Arizona State University. So I will show Weili's brief video at the end. So then next week we have the final one in this series with Imdat As and Silvio Carter looking at the city. And this has been a very popular series in terms of the videos which have been uploaded onto YouTube. And I would just recommend you to go and have a look at the others you haven't seen already. There's proved to be extraordinarily popular. So the idea behind this series, for those of you who's the first session, is to try and look at the two kind of components really that make this such a significant year, 2022, such a significant year in terms of the introduction of AI into architecture. And in particular, we've been looking at the first half of the sessions have been looking at the blue sessions, very Ukrainian colors here. The blue session has been looking at the tool itself, particularly the diffusion platforms that really have taken the world by storm and really changed people's attitude, woken people up to the world of AI. And then the second part, looking at the books which in a similar way have been years in development, but now have hit the scene And it's certainly for architecture, I think it is the moment when we're waking up to AI because of these two particular issues. And so on the one hand, we've had these the diffusion platforms. It's taken us from GANs, the previous dominant model, into something that is much more accessible and easy to use and quick and so on and so on. That is Midjourney, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, and so on. And then alongside that, then the books. We've got two we can look at next week. Imdat Ass's book and also Sylvia Carter's book on the city. And today we'll be looking at Lev Manovich, who is the author of AI Aesthetics, which came out before this. I mean, the other books on here all came out this particular year. So Lev is also going to be talking about his current book that he's also working on, and so we'll hear more from him later. Just to say, for those of you who noticed the poster for this is again another something that's been generated through Midjourney. It's an interesting kind of question when people say when people compliment me on a design. I say it wasn't me; it was Midjourney. I was writing the prompt, but somehow we have to try and sort of think through this kind of relationship between how we generate these things and also who is actually the responsible for them. I'll talk about that in more detail later. But just to say, I think the world of let's say the world of art and the world of architecture have a sort of long history or long history of interrelationship. It was, after all, Brunelleschi who invented perspective, an architect who invented perspective, and then Alberti who wrote about perspective originally. And again, more recently, we can talk about other architects, and we can think particularly people like Le Corbusier who are very active with their painting, Zaha Hadid, and people like Will Alsop. In many ways, it's very difficult to see these domains as being discrete domains. They overlap and fold into one another. And indeed, one could take the position that Paolo Antonelli takes, whereby architecture itself is merely part of a broad spectrum of design. And we can see how the edges or the definitions are blurring increasingly with the applications of these new tools that are opening up all sorts of domains, both for architects to engage with the world of art, but also technically possible for the world of art, for artists to engage with the world of architecture. So this is the kind of, in a sense, the background to what we're going to be addressing today. And I just want to say a few words about the world of art, in the sense, the way that it's kind of, it in many ways was ahead of the world of architecture in engaging with the world of AI, and possibly the first ever moment in many ways when symbolically the world of GANs began to interact with architecture was this particular projection by Refik Anadol in October 2018 onto the Walt Disney Concert Hall. One of the most famous media artists engaging with one of the most famous, building by one of the most famous architects of all time. But it's interesting to note that in 2018, really nothing was happening in architecture in terms of GANs. There had been, of course, a long history of engaging with AI, but not with these new techniques. And really, the world of media art was ahead of architecture. And this projection was supported by the technical expertise of Google through their group that's called the Artist Machine Intelligence Group, which was founded by Blaise Aguirre-Arcos in order to kind of provide support for artists who are interested in engaging with AI. And Blaise himself was responsible in 2018 for setting up the first ever exhibition of AI-generated art in San Francisco. At the time, of course, much of the work that he was showing was Deep Dream and so on, but Google AMI continues to be supporting artists and architects in the background, behind the scenes, as it were. 2018 was also a very famous moment in that it was the moment when the first AI-generated painting was auctioned by a major auction house, by Christie's, when this work that was generated by Obvious and called the Paris Collective, Obvious, with the name Edward de Bellamy, was auctioned. And it was in many ways very controversial, and I will come back to that question in a moment. 2018 was also the year in which the first art prize was won by an AI-generated art, when Mario Klingman's his work, The Butcher's Son, won the Lumen Prize. And of course, we can talk not only about Mario Klingman, but also about some other really wonderful AI artists whom we've hosted on Digital Futures before, including the extraordinary Sofia Crespo, who is one of the great pioneers in this new domain. the big question that I wanted to kind of like just pose as a way of a provocation at the very beginning of the session was well, who is the author in many ways of these things? I say this because of there have been a number of controversies, of course, that have come up recently. This particular case of when in the Colorado State Art Fair, something that's generated by a guy called Jason Allen won the prize and caused huge controversy, certainly in the art world. It's worth saying, though, that actually this won the prize of digitally manipulated photography. I'm not quite sure what's the right category for it, but nonetheless, it really kind of opened up a whole new debate about the role of AI in the generation of artworks. And I think you can see a very interesting kind of parallels between the world of photography or the introduction of photography and the introduction of AI. This is Walter Benjamin, and he famously, of course, commented on how, in the age of mechanical reproducibility, how the aura of a work of art withered. As you can reproduce things endlessly, so the aura of this original it gets eroded in some way. And what gets maybe called into question or eroded in some sense is maybe the kind of question of who is the author, or the question of copyright in the context of AI. And in the case of this work by Obvious, there's actually the law is not clear on this at this stage. Certainly in French law at the time, you couldn't give copyright to a machine. Although in British law, you could certainly give responsibility to the person who put together the artwork. And I think that's the way in which Pierre Froton is commenting here. We are the people who decided to do this, who decided to print on canvas, sign as a mathematical formula, put it in a gold frame, and therefore we're responsible. But the question is who is responsible for this? Is it the person who wrote the code? Is it the person who used the code? Is it the person whose works were in many ways became the data that it was all based on? I think these are interesting questions. We don't have any particular answer for it right now, but it is I think it's an area that needs to be addressed. It's certainly within law, that they're behind things. Artificial intelligence cannot be the inventor of new patents, certainly in the UK. So I want to just show a short piece by Mario Klingman about.
If you hear somebody playing a piano, would you ever ask, is the piano the artist? No. So same thing here. Just because it's a complicated mechanism, it doesn't change the roles. Memories of Passers-by is a machine that I created that will keep on generating portraits of non-existing people forever. And it can do that because it uses a collection of neural networks. And in this case, I used portraits painted by the great masters from Western European art history. And yes, so now the machine is in this in a cycle where it continuously creates new faces that start changing, that fade away, and it observes itself and creates a feedback loop. It's not a rendered video or a curated print or curated images that I pre-selected. It is doing it at that moment, which is a risky thing because it's a system where you have only a certain amount of foresight what it might do. The piece consists of 2 screens, of which one will show more female-looking portraits and the other one more male-looking portraits. And then there is a case which was kind of custom-made for this purpose because, yeah, the computer will not mind that is inside because that is, of course, it houses a very powerful machine which creates those paintings while you look at them. So I think that's quite magical. A typewriter enables somebody to write a book. For me, well, the keyboard enables me to write code. And then, well, yes, then there are neural networks involved, but maybe you could say they are my brushes that I learned to use, and but in the end, it's always this feedback between me, the artist, and the medium and the material, and is at least like a child that I can say, okay, now you go out in the world alone, and I can trust that you will keep on doing what I hoped you would do for, even if I'm not sitting next and am still able to change something. So that is kind of like a hard moment for me to say, like, okay, now I believe it's okay to take my hands off the keyboard and let it out in the world. Working with neural networks, in these days, it is actually not so easy to create an image this big. And this is 4K. It took me quite some research and different attempts to actually get it to work at this speed, like at real time and at this size. And well, yeah, not to be bragging, but I don't know many others at this point of time who can do the same.
Okay, I think what is interesting about this new domain is it raises lots of questions, because a lot of what's happening right now is so novel, you know, in terms of the kind of question of copyright and so on. So, I mean, so Mario Klingman takes a particular position, and in some ways you could somehow see his, as it were, children, as he puts it, a bit like the way that maybe an artist used to work in their atelier, or still do in their atelier, whereby there's a whole group of other artists supporting, actually doing the work, or indeed one can imagine and see parallels with the way an office like Zaha Hadid Architects is operating, whereby there was, or the figure no longer there even, and there are these hundreds of other sort of mini Zahas who are actually kind of producing the work according to the kind of the logic or the aesthetic of the atelier itself. And of course, you could say, well, what happens to the material that's copied from? We mentioned this briefly over the past few weeks, and I'll just simply touch on to say, well, you know, this was an article that I wrote as a counterpoint essay for an essay about copyright in AI for an issue of architectural design about copyright in architecture. And I argue actually that it is part of culture itself. And copying is part of culture. We copy trends, whether people are wearing a certain pair of sneakers or baseball cap or t-shirt, that this is catched on virally through the logic of the meme and also music and so on. Copying is endemic to how we operate as individuals. We don't step outside the logic of copyright, and especially architects. I remember talking at Columbia back in 1999 about my book Camouflage that yet to come out, and which addresses the question of copyright. And my students objected to me when we were going up in the elevator, and they said to me, but we're original architects, we don't copy anyone. And I said, well, just look around you and see who's not wearing black. And of course, the only person not wearing black at Columbia at the time was Bernard Schummi, who of course was wearing this red scarf and was teased mercilessly by the architects in charge. So the question then of copying, I think, is endemic to what we do. Indeed, we have this comment by Adorno: the human is indissolubly linked with imitation. A human being becomes human at all by imitating other human beings. And I just want to just briefly sort of touch upon, I think, something that's also relevant here. Ahmed El-Gamal in 2019 was the first person to have a solo show of his works. He's a computer scientist who uses AI to generate work using creative adversarial networks. And this is one of his works, Ich bin ein Berliner, and after the famous quote by JFK. And what he does, which I think is kind of interesting, he recognizes there is a canon to the world of art. So what the program is designed to do is to keep broadly within the canon, but to push the limits so that something slightly novel comes out. And I think that's the same is true for architecture. There is a canon of architecture. There are certain figures that we in some ways sort of emulate, but don't copy directly. And one can think of the famous names, Rem Koolhaas, Hadid, and so on and so on. And in many ways, I don't think that we're quite as original as we think. We often keep broadly within that canon. And even when you get people who kind of step outside it and do something highly novel, let's say like Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Bilbao, he ends up in a sense copying himself with subsequent works such as the Walt Disney Concert Hall that I showed before. I'm going to stop sharing now and pass on to Aaron Hertzmann. Aaron has, of course, been part of Digital Futures in the past, and he's very much a friend of Digital Futures. It's great to have someone with such authority from the kind of the world of computer science itself with us today. So Aaron, welcome.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be part of this and here with Lev Manovich. I just want to clarify, I'm not the chief researcher in Adobe. I'm just a researcher. And what I'm presenting here are really just my own personal opinions based on my academic research. And when I describe things I've been thinking about a lot recently in the context of what happens when new technologies that come along that change art, especially new media, new tools for making art. And this is, now especially relevant because we're living at this time where it really seems like there are these new tools coming around that are changing art, providing new tools for art. And it's just exciting, interesting, and a little scary to see what's going to happen. And so much has changed within the past 6 months that now suddenly there's this big, turmoil and conversation around it. And some of the things that inspired me to think about trends in this, I saw this very nice paper recently called The Sisyphean Cycle of Technology Panics, that described a lot of the typical things that happen in certain other kinds of technology changes. And there's also the notions of paradigm shift and disruptive innovation that are attempting to describe trends in changes in technology. And part of the context is with all of the things going on right now, can history help us better understand what's happening right now with AI art? And one theme I'm going to talk about more later is that we have all these things mixed into the notion of AI art, and I see there's being multiple separate concerns. There's new tools for art, new technologies for art, which I see as being very much a distinct concept from the issues around AI, and I'll come back to that later. But two high-level observations I want to make are that for that first box, I cannot think of a time in history when new media or new artistic tools are bad for art in the sense of creating bad art or dumbing down the quality of art. But people at each of these transitions, they say this thing is going to kill art. There are ethical issues with all around the space, but these are really issues of AI that happen to be operating the space of art. So here's some trends that I see across lots of different examples to varying degrees throughout history. The first is when some new technology comes along that can act as a tool for art or a different kind of medium for art, there's a period of experimentation, and there's a small community or a small group of people who are playing around with that tool and just seeing what it can do and trying to work with it. So the first photographs came in the 1820s, as Neil alluded to. Photography is like the main example we use as providing lessons for AI art. And people just experimented. They Instagrammed their food and they took selfies. But these were really tinkerers. They were really exploring what these technologies can do and playing with chemicals and optics and just trying to improve things. I had always thought of photography was just a thing someone invented it 100 years ago, and then now we have photography. But in reality, so when I visited Institut Lumiere in Lyon a few decades ago, I was just kind of surprised to see how much experimentation happened around this time that we've now forgotten about. People were experimenting with panoramic cameras and projectors and different ways to do color and different ways to do optics and so on. A huge period of experimentation where people create these new technologies, play with them, make new artistic experiments with them, and those feed back into new different kinds of ideas with the technology. And we've mostly forgotten about that period in photographic history, unless we're like real buffs. So there's this period where there's all this fascination with a small group of people playing with technology, with the novelty of it. And we don't really remember the works from that time, again, unless you really study this material. One of the experimentations that came out of that is the development of film. So this is one of the first moving pictures that existed in the world, Lumiere's first experiment. And again, it just must have been so exciting just to see a picture moving. We've seen the same thing in the AI art world. So Neil mentioned a Deep Dream, which I think was the beginning of the current wave of excitement around AI art, which was just some cool blog post from Google Research, which immediately was shown in art contexts. And just this in the past 7 years, there's this back and forth cycle of researchers write papers like Pix2Pix and CycleGAN and PPGAN, and then artists start playing with that code that they download from GitHub and make cool stuff with. This is one from Memo Upton. 2018, we had Big GAN, Style GAN, and then all this cool stuff came out of that. So there's really been this rapid cycle between researchers writing code, publishing papers, sharing stuff online, and then artists immediately playing with that, kicking the tires and seeing what it can do as an artistic tool. So when people like the art critic Ben Davis say the dominant AI aesthetic is novelty, I say, of course it is, because this is a new thing. And the first thing you do is experiment with it and see what it can do. And in art, the stage's office is about novelty. Computer art has often been this way. So like this is a classic work of computer art from the 70s, which I never found that aesthetically interesting. But I'm sure at the time it was just like so dazzling and cool to see. And the same goes for a lot of the early AI artwork pieces. The second trend I want to point to is that the styles in new technologies often mimic the existing technologies, and then they evolve into being their own thing. And this idea here that is that every artistic medium has its own language that's really distinct from the other ones. And many of them begin by mimicking existing ones, which is something Janet Murray has pointed out. So in the case of photography, it began by mimicking paintings. Paintings often have these classical, or at least classical paintings, when one particular style of painting had this sort of very composed tableau and very classical compositions with very specific sort of moral statements. And the early pictorialist photographers were directly imitating this. They were composing photographs to have the same style as this sort of, David style painting. Very much in the goal of making something that was mimicking traditional styles of art. So the painters responded by saying, well, okay, that's not, we're going to do something different for art. Art is actually going to be these more atmospheric, impressionistic things. So this is a Whistler painting. And so the pictorialists adopted that style, and they showed that they could make that kind of art with photography as well. And it was really a few decades before photography really adopted its, before the photographers discovered and developed the unique language of photography as distinct from painting. The same happened with film. This is what Janet Murray talked about. At first, it was just exciting to see the pictures move. Just the novelty of the technology was exciting. The first real storytelling that happened with film were very much like stage plays. They would have a static camera filming a static stage set with actors making the big dramatic gestures of like vaudeville style stage performances. So it was really much like filming a stage play. It was not a separate tool or medium, even though I'm sure it was exciting. And it really was decades before directors and editors discovered the unique media of film, of editing, cuts, montage, different kinds of camera movements. And it was really decades between the invention of the medium to when it was really mature as its own medium. And all the things that we think of as masterpieces in film are from decades later. Like, unless you're a film buff, you probably don't, aren't aware of any films from before the 1930s. And it's hard to predict how these media are going to develop. So, Les Paul sort of developed the solid body electric guitar in the 1940s. He played, jazz swing tunes. No one at the time could have predicted how this was going to evolve as an artistic tool and how the impact it was going to have on culture. So is the same thing happening in AI art? Well, definitely a big part of AI art is about seeing, can we make things that look like paintings? Or I think some of the things like the Helena Sarum print here very much has the look of generative art that is, computer art from before, 10 years ago. And I, for one, have certainly been surprised by what it's like when you use like the text to image tools as an artistic medium. So you think in the way like things like DALL-E were initially presented, and you type in text and you get amazing artwork out. And that's not really what it's like to actually use it. You type in some things and you have some ideas. And my experience was, I would do this with friends or on my own. And this one set of ideas will lead to another set of ideas. I was playing with artworks in the style of various famous artists and generative artists. And then one idea led to playing with architectural styles and then with portraits. And I went on this whole long journey of experimenting with different visual ideas and coming up with things using DALL-E that I never would have thought to experiment with. And in fact, some of this architectural experimentation is, I think, what led me to get connected with Digital Futures. So the point is that if we just tell you how these algorithms work, you don't have the experience of actually working with a medium and seeing what it's like to use this as its own artistic medium. And I don't believe that these text-to-image tools like DALL-E are going to be the future medium, but this is just an example of how much you learn just from experimenting with a medium. The third trend I want to point to is the backlash. This will kill art. This has no soul. this is going to dumb down art. And this has happened again, certainly with photography. The great Turner at early daguerreotype presentation says, "This is the end of art. I'm glad I've had my day." A few decades later, the poet Charles Baudelaire reviews a photography salon by saying, "If photography is allowed to stand in for art, it will corrupt it completely, thanks to the stupidity of the multitude." So this is a new technology that's going to replace and kill art. There's various psychological studies that examine why this is, this sort of status quo bias, the sort of default assumption that we have, or a lot of people have, to assume that new technologies are going to be bad. This is a very nice paper that's published in a psychology journal earlier, a few months ago, where they asked participants to rate whether a particular new technology they described is going to be good or bad for society. And different participants were given the same description of the invention, but a different year of its invention. And they consistently rated things as being more harmful if the year of invention is after the birth. If it was invented before they were born, changing only that number, the participants were more likely to rate it as being a positive impact. So we on average, people have this tendency to be distrustful of new technologies. And there's many possible reasons for this. One possible reason is that it's hard to imagine, for some people at least, the amorphous, ambiguous benefits of some new technology. Like how is this going to transform society? Are people going to adapt to it? It's much easier to think about, here's this thing we have, this artistic thing. I'm worried about losing that. I'm afraid of losing it, without thinking about the things that we're going to gain, which are amorphous. Another example of this backlash, very different example is hip hop, which had many different causes and sources. One of which was the use of dual turntables with a fader that could be scratched. And this was, in the 80s, a lot of people were saying this is not music, and radio is being dumbed down. There are many different reasons for that, which I'll come back to. Racism was a big part of it. And part of it was also, it's a new medium, it's a new technology. It doesn't look like the music that I grew up with. And I feel like I've heard so many times throughout my life, people saying popular music today sucks. It was all better back in the 90s or back in the 80s or back in the days of Elvis and the Beatles. That was when we had good music. And my favorite example of this is this jazz critic who talks about how pop music today is all terrible. It went downhill with Elvis. Before 1950s, that's when pop music was good. And indeed, there's also psychological evidence that people on average tend to prefer music from their formative years, like roughly from the ages 10 to 20. For most of us, and most on average, the music people love the most, that they say is the best, that they have the most association with, it's from this time. And if you're older than those ages, then it's maybe more likely that you don't like the music today. So now when we see people say things, I've never seen the AI art that's as good as Rembrandt, or GPT poetry that's as good as Dante. That seems like an impossibly high standard to me, that this entirely new technology that's only been around for a little while is going to have created art that is going to give you experiences as rich as your most formative, greatest artistic experiences you've had in your life. The fourth trend is that the technical skills that are required change. Some become not important, but there's also more opportunities for different kinds of people to be creators. And so we're hearing a lot, and we've often heard them a lot, this will kill jobs for artists, and there's some truth to that, but it's a lot more complex than that also. So, look at portraiture as one example of something that was very affected by photography. If you were very wealthy, you could have your portrait painted before photography. If you were not super wealthy, then you could have these silhouette pictures made, which are not a great visual likeness. And so when photography came around, it was faster, more convenient, cheaper, and a lot of portrait studios were replaced with photography. A lot of these portrait painters had to learn this new technology. And at least one portrait painter basically said years later, photography harmed painting considerably and has killed portraiture because it very much replaced this more functional technology. This is true throughout many other forms since then. Cinematography is one where you would have, at some point, large, complicated camera systems and a big crew to operate it. By the 80s, you could have indie film directors just like doing their own cinematography. And now, of course, anyone can make movies basically using their phones and YouTube. Likewise, other aspects of the film process. Film used to be shot on these celluloid strips. You would have to cut them with scissors, tape them up, keep track of these strips of film, and there would be potentially a crew or a staff whose job it is just to keep track of these strips of film and to put them together. With digital video, this became much, much easier and required a lot less labor. And now, again, anyone can be doing digital video editing on their phone or on YouTube. This doesn't mean that there aren't still this incredible amount of high-end jobs, but the quality and the technology is so much better. And we now have TV shows that are just running on essentially cable that are way higher production values and can tell in a way like visually richer stories than the biggest budget big movies from 20 years ago. Computer animation is another place that it seemed like it was going to replace cell animators. At least the animators themselves who worked at Disney were frightened of the computer. They thought it was going to take their jobs away. And in reality, computer animation is this enormously skilled task that involves a lot of talent and artistic skill. And a lot of cell animators have since then had to learn this technology while still reusing the essential skills of creating life with animation. And now you look at the credits for any animated movie, VFX film, or TV show, and the number of people that are employed to make these high-end works of art is very large. On the end of sort of more kind of low-end creators or people who work with fewer tools, my favorite example of this is Old Town Road, which you may remember is the song of the summer from 3 years ago. Lil Nas X was kind of this nobody working in his bedroom, and he would just like try to make songs on his own. He would go to YouTube to find beats for his music, and he found one by this guy Young Kyo, who was like working in his attic in the Netherlands on his keyboard and his laptop. And he sampled a Nine Inch Nails song, turned that into a beat, put it for sale on YouTube. Lil Nas X used that and made his own song around it, and it was a huge hit. And there's like no part of that story that I can imagine having happened 10 or 20 years ago. And there's this lovely video interview with them on the New York Times website about that process. The fifth trend I want to point to is that in some of these cases, these new artistic media cause us to rethink what it is art is. And again, photography is really the exhibit A for this. That first, when people could create high quality, all in focus photographs, artists said, well, maybe they don't have to be in focus; they can be more impressionistic. And then artists started to think, well, maybe art isn't really about making realistic, super realistic paintings. And this, long story short, this led to the whole trend of modern art. I really think that modern art is a trend that came about, at least in part, in response to the challenge of photography. It made artists and theorists rethink what an artist is and what art is. We see other examples. So hip hop made people rethink a lot of ways what music is, and in part was by emphasizing the importance of remix and copying. And there's this lovely series on the web called Everything is a Remix. And now, since Neil mentioned that the essay Culture of Copying, I'm definitely going to take a look at that as well, because that seems like it's very much in the same spirit. And people have pointed out that, like as Neil says, all of culture, Homer and Shakespeare, these are all people taking ideas from different sources and adding something new to them, remixing them in different ways. And of course, now hip hop is very much an institutionalized part of our culture. People don't question anymore whether or not it's music, except extreme right-wing circles. Now, this isn't to say that just because a new technology is new, that it's going to have this kind of impact. And there's been lots of things like smell-o-vision gimmicks in movie theaters in the 50s that, really just gimmicks. 3D cinema has something which has come and gone. And I've seen some 3D movies that reuse the technology wonderfully, but it's just not clear it's going to be here to stay. One more example is people have presented NFT smart contracts as though they are going to be a new art form, and I really just haven't seen it yet. And the final trend I want to point to, which is really the more complicated one that I'm going to not say a whole lot about, is that there's other socioeconomic issues around the art form that are not part of it being an art form. Like I said, again, hip hop, really when people talk about hip hop, the story is around, socioeconomic issues, class, race, life in the outer boroughs in New York in the 70s, racism and so on, as well as the new technology. And so I really see when we have new tools for art, new artistic media, to me, this is just unambiguously good. We get new ways for people to express and create and to explore culture. Within the broader world, we're living this time where these so-called AI tools and new technologies have really ambiguous and difficult and concerning issues in our society, as well as exciting stuff. And that's really the issues I think that happen in AI art. So I really think that when we're now having this big discussion around ethics in the AI art world. These things really mirror broader questions about AI within the world. And in the sense, this is because art is a playground for the broader issues, a microcosm of the issues in the broader world. And just a few examples. There's been concern around bias and representation in the results from text to image. You type in CEO in earlier versions of DALL-E and it gives you white males. And this very much mirrors this criticisms people have had of image search engines, such as Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. Now the big argument is around consent for images that were used for training data. This again mirrors broader questions in our society about when can models be built on our data and our own personal behaviors and so on, and then monetized by other people. And I'll also point to Kyle McDonald has written about earlier uses of facial data sets in artworks and potential ethical issues around that in the art world. And finally, I just wanted to mention that this also speaks to the broader AI hype has happened in the broader world. And here the relevant issue is that when people present computers as though they are the artists, this is an instance of AI hype. And unfortunately, I think it supports for people who don't know anything about computers, this notion of AI sentience. And we've seen various ways that there are real harms in presenting these AI algorithms as though they were actually intelligent and not just code that people wrote. So to summarize kind of the main trends, at a high level here, these new media technologies start with experimentation, people playing around with them, and then there's a backlash. The tools become more mature, and then at some point, if they're successful, they become kind of the traditions, and we don't think of them as experimental anymore. I cannot think of a new artistic tool and medium that was bad for art in the long run. None of these things that people said were going to kill art or make artists obsolete, they never did that. They were always expanding the expressive possibilities for art. And there are definitely difficult and potentially concerning or scary legal issues and ethical issues around these that mirror those in the broader AI world. And I want to kind of close out with this quote I really like from a talk by Brenda Laurel, where she says that computers are a projection surface for our hopes and fears for what it means to be human. And it's very easy to get obsessed with the technology because it's so cool and so interesting and so fun to play with. But in the end, these are tools for humans to express themselves and communicate with other humans. And so that's really, it's the how it affects and benefits or hurts people is really what matters in the end. I really think good art will always be hard to make because what we care about is the art that people make. We don't ultimately care about the technology. The technology only serves as a tool. And so as a result, we're always going to want and need to have artists. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. That was terrific. That's raised a lot of questions that we'll no doubt come back to later. Lev, shall we move directly on to you if you'd like to share your screen? And let's hope we don't have too many computer glitches, internet glitches. Lev, great to see you. You're muted.
Oh, sure I am. So thank you so much, Neil, for inviting me to your ongoing conversation. And I'm actually very, very happy to hear and to meet in person Aaron, because I know about his work. And let me share the screen. Okay, here we go. And we'll start by looking at Aaron's Google Scholar page. So obviously, we are in the presence of a extremely productive computer scientist with a high H index of 64, who also thinks deeply, systematically about media art, history of technology, and is able to place most recent development in this history. And just looking at the titles of Aaron's early articles, I'm going to read them all, right? Image Analogist, 2001, Spy Machines 2000. So obviously Aaron is a true pioneer here, and we're not so far apart, because in fact I was trained as an artist when I studied architecture in Moscow before migrating to US. I went to FIU Film School, and between 1984 and 1993, for 6 years, I was working as a commercial computer animator, and was created or participated in the creation of hundreds of TV commercials and movie titles which use 3D computer graphics. And then I actually went for a PhD in experimental psychology and took classes in computer vision at FIU, right? Probably at the same Cortland Institute where I think Aaron was studying. And then started to use Photoshop and our Adobe products as soon as they come out in 1990. And lots of my thinking, lots of my writing revolves around the most widespread, digital tools such as Photoshop, Premiere, After Effects, and their effects on culture, moving image culture, visual culture, design culture, and so on. So I want to talk about AI and AI aesthetics, both in terms of continuity, right? So one argument is that radical as it looks, the effects of new technology on aesthetics, right, which we see in the eye, is not a new thing, and there has been equally significantly effects of earlier computer media technologies on aesthetics, but also kind of focus on how it is different from our things. And since the session is about books, I'll first mention briefly my 2013 book, Software Takes Command, which actually was a revised version of an earlier version, which I put together in 2007, which I published online as open source. And then nobody was reviewing it, so eventually I rewrote it and published it as a real book of Bloomsbury Academic. So that book was, I think, the first, and maybe still the only long history of the thinking which led to the development of computer media in the 60s. So dealing with people like Alan Kay, Ivan Sutherland, Douglas Engelbart, and then focusing on kind of what happens in the 90s when tools such as Photoshop, PageMaker, and especially After Effects hit mainstream. And in the course of about 10 years, the workspace, workflow of people who design animations, and video, graphics, and so on becomes digital, right? So I'll just read, a couple of lines from book description. What motivated the developers in the 1960s and 1970s to create the concepts and techniques which now underlie contemporary applications such as Photoshop, Illustrator, and Final Cut? How do these tools shape the visual aesthetics of contemporary media design? So the word aesthetics is already there. What happens to the idea of medium after previously media-specific tools have been simulated and extended into the software? And one of the main arguments in this book is that the computer is not just a media, but the computer is metamedium. And that's a concept which was developed by Alan Kay, who led a research group in Xerox PARC, which in the early 90s really invented the modern graphical computer with graphical user interface, copy and paste, the ability to change fonts and text. He really developed the idea of modern computer. And Alan Kay, in one of his articles around 1970, he actually used it in a few articles, already used the term metamedia. And I kind of taking this term from Kay, I developed it further in the book. And they argue that the computer is a metamedia because with tools like Photoshop, After Effects, Final Cut, Houdini, Maya, and so on, not only the computer can simulate most of the existing media which existed before. So if you're in Photoshop, right, you can paint with different kinds of brushes, oil brush, Japanese style brush. You can turn your drawing into a woodcut, into whatever you want. And the same thing happens with sound, video, and so on. So that's one reason why computer is not just a medium, but a meta-medium. And the second reason is that Alan Kay and people around him have argued that, or rather, the way we designed, right, the new computer at Xerox PARC was to develop a new object-oriented programming language, Smalltalk, and when everything was written in Smalltalk, and then we started kind of using this machine in classes around Xerox PARC in schools, and we claimed that many school children were able to extend what this computer can do, and we developed new tools. So Alan Kay, the second main idea was that not only you can simulate existing media in a computer, but you can extend it, right? You can add new effects, new transformation, new filters, etc., etc. And we have seen many this new media coming out from computer. For example, hypertext, right, is a kind of new media. I mean, World Wide Web, which extends the idea of hypertext, to a global network, is a new media. VR is a new media, and so on and so forth. So I took these ideas and I wrote a whole book, developing it in detail. And and then I also talk about how in the second part of the 90s, when designers started to use the new software called After Effects, it completely redefined the aesthetics and the language of video animation. It led to aesthetics where you have lots of transparency layers. It also led to aesthetics where everything is changing in the frame, right? So everything being animated because you can animate any parameter, and that I take as a case study. So going on, let's go back to books. Okay. So the next book, I mean, I have like 15 books, but we'll just talk about a few. So the next book, which is probably what Neil wanted me to focus more, but I'll just mention it, was called AI Aesthetics. It's a very small, 52 pages, was published at the very end of 2018. And as Neil pointed out, it was written before, right, the recent AI image synthesis revolution. And again, in this book, I kind of talk about what I already saw as emerging effects of AI. At this point, you already have, for example, tools like in Photoshop, which automatically select the main subject in the photo, right, with very fine edge. And probably this one tool has more effects on contemporary visual culture than everything else combined, because it's used by millions of times by 25 official users of Adobe software, and how many millions unofficial users. And you also had already thousands of apps for your phone, which would beautify your photo. So you also have starting 2016, the phones which would again automatically select the subject. I think Apple was first introduced the subject, and also since I think 2017, the photo would continuously monitor what's in front of it, and would use kind of computer vision to try to guess what type of scene was in front of it. Was it a person, a group photo, a landscape, a sunset? And then when you press the button, it will automatically adjust capture or post-processing parameters to give you the best photo for the subject, right? So already very significant effects were on the scene. And then to continue, there's a third book, which is the one I'm kind of writing now, and it's a collaboration with a wonderful scholar who teaches actually the top architecture and design school in Italy, in Venice, but lives in Berlin, Emanuele Ariely. It's called Artificial Aesthetics, a critical guide to AI media design. And we kind of started 2 chapters in the end of 2021. And the idea was that in this particular period, and we don't know how long it will last, so maybe AI spring will eventually become like AI fall, but we don't know. Hopefully not. We don't want to write a book and then wait 2-3 years before it's published by a traditional publisher. We want to put out some ideas and have them in the world, and basically play a role in the critical discussion of this AI revolution. So I convinced Emmanuel, who is a bit more academic than me, and I kind of made my whole career of internet. I basically started to publish everything I write on the internet since '94. So I said, look, let's just, as soon as we finish a chapter, as soon as we're happy, let's just put it online. And you can see the first chapter was published December 15, 2021. The next one was January, March, May. And in July, I started to use Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, and created thousands of images, and also posted about 13 theoretical posts with some theoretical ideas on Facebook. So now in the next few weeks, I will try my best to put them together, and then you'll have a new chapter. So now I want to actually show you one thing, actually. Okay, so so as I mentioned, right, for me, so one way to think about the current stage of AI, visual AI development, and this particular paradigm of AI image synthesis, is that it's obviously something very, very important, something very new, but the creators' tools, right, the tools for creation, for architects, designers, video makers, and so on, we already had very smart tools, right, built from the beginning. And whether we call a particular tool AI or not, I think it's really impossible to say, because it doesn't matter, right, what technology it uses. So it doesn't matter if a particular tool uses a conventional deterministic algorithm, or if it uses trained neural network, right? In terms of its psychological or kind of historical or aesthetic effect, it's magic, right? And maybe Aaron will be very surprised, or maybe pleased, or maybe he doesn't care. But for me, the most magical tools, which I use every day in my art, are not, Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, which we'll talk about in a second, which are wonderful but kind of hard to control, right? But so in a way, the tools which now became more mundane because we have been around maybe for at least 10 years, if not longer, which are built into Photoshop. So specifically, so here, for example, one drawing, from my 20s, right? So here's one drawing, here's here's another drawing, and I've been simply, copying parts of this drawing and then putting them together into the new one, okay, into the new one, and simply, the ability to copy and paste, and the ability to match the color, which using maybe conventional algorithms, to me, this is equally magical. And I think that for most people, right, because again, the ability to copy and paste has been around, right, for 30 years, but maybe what's more magical for more people is what I think is maybe the most important new development in Adobe products, which is the ability to automatically select the kind of main subject. First it was human, but I think now you can select animals and all kinds of things, in a picture, and then you can cut it out, right? You can change background, you can make the subject, more contrasty, more detailed. So we'll just, test it out, right? So here's my photo in Bali in 2019. And what we'll do is we'll just go here and say, select a mask, right? And we'll just say select subject. Okay, we'll process it on the cloud so get better results, but it works anyway. And okay, we will do it. And just tried it before, so hopefully it works. Not sure, it's always like demo and die. So you try something, just a second, not sure. Okay, not sure why. Actually, not sure why it's all everything selected. It worked. I'm so sorry. It worked wonderfully. Just actually, just a second. I wonder why it looks kind of oh, here it is, right? Here it is actually. Okay, what is this? Okay, just a second. I don't know why it's. Okay, let me try just a moment. Not sure what happened here. Okay. Here we go. Sorry. Okay. Okay, select the mask. So select subject. I know it worked like 5 minutes. Yeah, here it is, right? And you can see how it automatically selected me, very, very fine edge. And I don't care, right? As a user, I don't care if this is a deterministic algorithm or this is neural network. I'm actually not sure, but this tool has been around, I think, for at least 10 years, but it became much better. But this is as consequential for the aesthetics of contemporary visual culture as anything else, right? As anything else, because this is what people are going to be using, millions of times per day. Now, let's go and talk now about actually, right, the latest development, which is AI image synthesis. So there are different software offerings with DALL-E 2, Google Imagen, with Midjourney, with Stable Diffusion, and people have already wrote some plugins for Photoshop, which you can do AI image synthesis inside Photoshop, and I assume, but probably Aaron is the one who would know, sooner or later, maybe sooner, we would get maybe similar tools officially from inside Photoshop and Premiere and our Adobe products. Now, as you know, some of these neural networks, right? So some of these services use neural networks which have been trained. In fact, Stable Diffusion, right? Stable Diffusion has been trained on the data set of over 5 billion pairs of images and text. So we say images and text descriptions, which and kind of a German group have harnessed, right, from internet, organized, and then made available, right, for free online. So our researchers can use it. And the whole data set it's used is called Lion 5B, right? So 5 billion image pairs. And with Stable Diffusion, from what I've read, right, it's been trained on different subset with 5 billion image text pairs data set. But when the last few stages of training to kind of fine-tune a model, we used a very particular part of this data set, which is called line aesthetics. And what it is, it's a few hundred million images where the aesthetic model, right, so computational model, which was trained to simulate human aesthetic judgments, right, rates each image in terms of its aesthetic beauty, right, aesthetic perfection, on the scale of 1 to 10, and only images which have scale more than 5 are included in this data set, right? And right, so you go to this website, you can read about it. There are some very interesting details about how it's trained, and we find out that, for example, I mean the whole process. But if I have like 5 more minutes at the end, I'll talk about it. But what I want to do is I want to go to a different website which shows you kind of examples, right? I mean, tens of thousands of examples from this data set. And this is absolutely important because if you noticed that when we use Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, and so on, right, the model has a particular aesthetic unconscious, so to speak, right? The model has particular aesthetic biases. So, for example, if you simply type like square or cube or cylinder, right, into Midjourney, you're not going to get some kind of neutral line drawing of a cylinder, but you'll get very aestheticized drawing of a cylinder, right? If you simply type a sky, you'll get this very dramatic, kind of very pictorial, right? Very aesthetic sky. So where does this exaggerated, right, aesthetics kind of built into the software comes in? Well, partly, right? I mean, the process of training this network is very complex, but I think partly it comes from this, right, the data set such as this one, and it's very, very useful to see, right, what images the model rated as low, and which images is model rated as high, because as I said, only images for Stable Diffusion, right, only images which are rated 5 and higher are used to in the final stages of training, right? So this is like 0 to 1, and we can see that this is. And one thing I want to mention again. So how does this aesthetic model is created? So this research on artificial aesthetics, right? Trying to teach the computer to predict human aesthetic judgment. I think it starts as early as 2006, as far as I know, but maybe earlier. So what we do is, we would get, let's say thousands and later hundreds of thousands of images, which already have aesthetic ratings, because maybe photographers, rated photographs on the website, or maybe we use Mechanical Turk. So sometimes it would be professionals like photographers, sometimes it would be just anybody, people who happen to be working for Amazon doing Mechanical Turk job. And then, the computer would analyze all kinds of image characteristics, textures, lines, compositions, color, and try to predict the human rating, right? And then this model has been run, right, on hundreds of millions of images from this 5 billion data set. And so these are the ratings, right, which the model gives images, but again, originally were based on the human ratings. So in a way, what it is, it's a reflection, right? It's aesthetic judgments, which are not aesthetic judgments of me or Aaron or Neil or students from Bartlett, right, or students from Parsons, or like people who run Guggenheim Museum. These are aesthetic judgments of normal people who don't really have any art history training, and you'll see this reflected, right? So this is the aesthetic, which then becomes, as I said, the default built-in aesthetics of these models. And while you can do anything else, you can fight against it. It actually takes an effort to get rid of these aesthetics when you use Midjourney or Stable Diffusion. So this is 0, right? So you have images which basically we can see it's just captures from a web. So lots of it is type, but when you look at this image, right? For example, this one, there's nothing wrong with this image, but for whatever reason, it's rated 0. And when you have images like this, which are blurry and so on, so you notice mostly it's text, and there's no central subject, right? And again, from somebody's perspective, there's nothing wrong with images, but I guess in comparison to images which are rated 5 and 10, which you'll see later, these images are not beautiful, right? So there's a particular idea of beauty, right, which is being promoted here, and then gets built into these models, which are used by tens of millions of people now, right? So when we keep going, now we keep getting to 3. So one thing we notice, there is more contrast, right? There's usually something in the center, so something stands out. So usually, maybe it's a title, and still there are no photographs, right? So when we keep going, we got to 4, right? Let's keep going. So now we start getting photographs, and you can see, for example, these photographs have on a white background. So again, the subject really came out. And that's something which I associate with kind of commercial graphic design or commercial photography, because these images have to be read by people, right? Or seen by people who are maybe, driving car or taking on a subway, with not ideal lighting. So we're looking at these images on their phone. So the images have to be very graphic and has to be read very easily. I'm sorry, not everything got loaded. So now we got to 5. So these are the images which we included, right? Images rated with more than 5, which we included into this data set, which was used to fine-tune the model. And again, right, we're very different, right? So there's photography, but much more photography around, less than graphic design. And I started to wonder, right, if there are particular aesthetic terms I can use to summarize a kind of meta-aesthetics which these images share, right? So let's continue, right? And I think that these terms, I would say it's clarity, right? There's a kind of main subject which stands out. So these images are very readable, right? The brain can process them very quickly. And also I would say they're typically not ambiguous, right? So there's a woman in a hat, and that's very clear, right? There's 2 girls, right? So something which brain can process quickly. And when we continue, right, and we're kind of wondering, right, if Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, and so on can make very beautiful painting effects, why there are no paintings? So finally, when we get to 6 and 7, we start getting paintings, and sometimes we see, real high art paintings. So this is by very famous contemporary Chinese artists, but mostly it's a kind of paintings which, and some are classical, right? But mostly it's a paintings which and again, I am not using this word in a kind of, in a negative sense. I'm using it as a description, which we would call kitschy, right? Kind of, so something like a fantasy illustration or maybe concept art. So basically something we associate with websites such as DeviantArt or ArtStation. And then finally, right, we got to the end. It's interesting, right? With a model, which I guess reflects the aesthetic taste of people, who were originally rated initial set of images, it kind of puts paintings at the end, right? So paintings are rated as the most aesthetic, which of course is a very particular, right? Is a very particular judgment, right? There is nothing universal, there is nothing kind of historically general about the fact, but these people living in this particular culture, and mostly because this is trained again on judgments of particular people, like as the designers for models say, these people are weird, which means they're white, they're typically North America, they're actually interested in technology, we typically don't have art training, and also live in a democratic country, and that's the kind of images people think is art, right? So that's the end. So finally, Neil, how many minutes do I have left?
Yeah, but fine. Just keep going. Keep going. Fine.
Yeah. Okay. So now, so this is what's interesting, right? So now I will show you something else, which is so online there are hundreds of different blog posts and videos and even PDFs which illustrate all different effects you can do with AI image synthesis models, right? And this is a particular guide from the summer for DALL-E, but you can get the similar things from our software. So as you can see, right, the software is actually capable of imitating, right, hundreds of different media. So that's why it's metamedia or like metamedia plus, and also styles of different artists. But there is a particular general aesthetic bias, which I think comes from this aesthetic model, aesthetic scores, which I just showed you, right? But the software can do something else, right? You can simulate Bansky, pencil drawing, line art, watercolor, digital painting, mythological map, right? So these are basically effects of different, putting these different terms into the prompts you would give to DALL-E, but it works exactly the same as in Stable Diffusion Midjourney. And you can also simulate, right, various historical styles and so on and so forth. And you find lots of images, but the majority of images, right, if people don't do it, what you actually get is something which is in some ways more similar to this, right? Illustrative, as I said, right? I don't quite know how to describe it, but I would say one thing is that it's dramatic, right? So exaggerated contrast, it's very colorful. And the research in computer science, in fact, have shown that this is the qualities people also like in photographs. People like higher contrast, people like more saturation, and also very clear. So in my own work, right, because I was trained as an artist since the age of 12, and then, as I told you, I went to architecture school, NYU Film School, and was working in computer graphics. When I got my PhD, and then I spent 20 years teaching digital art, right? So it's kind of working with students who do visual things. And then I became a professor of computer science, but I'm not the real one, in contrast to Aaron, because I've never taken a single computer science class. It's simply when I came to a graduate center, we said, we kind of want you we want you for your brand, but we don't know where to put you. We think you can go into our history of computer science. And I thought about, so I will go into computer science, but again, like I never actually studied it, although, I can read papers by smart people like Aaron, and of course I programmed all my life. So I will first show you, so what I was trying to do, right, since the summer, is to get these tools in a way to work against the grain, right, to get rid of this more default, clear, unambiguous, colorful kind of painted aesthetics, and to try to create something which would not necessarily be exactly like my early artworks, but at least will have similar moods. And these are just examples, of my early artworks. This is portrait of my mother, ink on paper when I was 18, right? And I learned to draw like this because I had to study to pass exams into architecture schools. And So these are just some examples, like things like this is actually from a few years ago, just to show you, right? So this is again my early 20s. So when I immigrated from Soviet Union, and I was trying to kind of come to terms with my past and with a country which I thought I would never see again because it was not really possible to travel back. And of course, with lots of parallels to the situation in Russia today, but that's a whole other talk. So this is my drawings, between ages of 22, kind of 25. And then very recently, right, this summer, I started to draw again. This was the first drawing I did. This was the second drawing I did. And now I'll show you what I was doing with, so this is Midjourney, right? Again, this is from the summer. I work in cities. And the idea was to try to, by using different words, right, and the keywords, try to create something which, at least in the atmosphere, in the mood, in the feeling, would kind of match, right, my own aesthetics. And it's possible to use these models, right, to create something maybe not so clear, more moody. And of course, I'm not the only one, but you have to work very hard to fight this kind of aesthetic bias, which is somewhere inside the network between trillions of weights, right, on all these neurons. Okay, but people had, I think, very positive response to these images. Since I started doing it in July, I started publishing online. I was already in the 4 exhibitions. In fact, somebody asked me if I want to do a big personal exhibition in Portugal next year. There have been 3 articles about it. So people like it, and I also got comments with Gleb, this is really unlike anything we saw from AI tools. I said, yeah, but it's because I've been doing art for 50 years. So this was the series of images. Again, this is on Midjourney, where I thought about writers in Soviet Union, 20th century, how some most talented artists were killed, or simply people were afraid, right, to even not even to publish, but even afraid to write certain works of literature. So the idea was that the prompt said something like pages of writings, which is partly erased. And what I've done is that I basically edit all these images in Lightroom. So in our kind of ad for Adobe, and I don't change anything in the content structure. What I do is I usually put a little bit of vignette, and maybe I use the wonderful clarity and clarity tools, so just to give more clarity. So I actually try to give them try to make them a bit more dramatic, but I still have this kind of dark mood, and then. And then, I had another series which was called Russian Students. So it was called actually Russian Students on September 20th. September 20th was a particular date when I don't remember what happened, but Putin, I think Putin announced, right, like a draft, that we're going to draft 300,000 people. We actually drafted 500,000. And again, this is my imaginations of like smart, maybe high school students from Moscow or from, university students who understand that Russia is not going to have any future and the Russian symbolic capital is lost forever, right? And I was kind of fascinated by the ability with networks, on the one hand, to create faces where every face is a bit different. When sometimes you enter the same prompt, every face is the same. And that's like, there's lots of amazing abilities which networks have, but that's another talk. And then this is using stable diffusion. So same kind of similar prompts. So, and partly I'm thinking about like young Russians today, who of course, people who are younger, of course, don't believe propaganda, we don't believe in war, but people who are older, who get their news from TV, do believe it. I'm also thinking about me, like in 1977, when I was in the last year of high school, and maybe this is imaginary photographs of my classmates, but there are no photographs left. So there are very interesting issues about historical memory. And again, to get away from this aesthetics of clarity, right, from this precision, I use words and prompt such as out of focus, or I would say mist or fog. So you get this more foggy, misty, kind of moody photographs. And when I kind of tried, right, I also tried to get these tools to simulate the texture or just simply simulate drawing. And to my surprise, it doesn't work very well, right? So again, maybe in a few months it becomes possible, but I tried, right? I tried all kinds of different prompts. And in fact, I gave a system my real drawings, right? Which you saw a second earlier, as part of the input, right? But when you see, right, when you see what it's doing, it actually doesn't look like a human drawing, right? At least in this case. Maybe I haven't tried hard enough. And then I will finish by showing you something which is very different, which in fact is my image series, which people like the most. And I feel very ambivalent about it because yes, very pretty images, but to me, we have this kind of commercial pretty quality, but people liked it a lot. And what it is that basically the prompt was a Soviet city, a modern city designed in Russia in the 1960s, as painted by Bosch on a large wooden panel. So you get these images which obviously have references, compositional details to the wonderful art of Bosch, right? 15th century Dutch Netherlands painter, but there is also some strange things going on. And again, people like it, but I do feel ambivalent about these images because to me, there's something more commercial about them, but not. And I'm really interested, right, to try to do. And here I will show you the last thing. So taking my original drawing from maybe 1984 or 1982, when putting it as an input to Stable Diffusion, and when you use the image as a part of your prompt, you can give image away 20%. So I think if we give it 100%, you get exactly the image. But when I try to give it like 70, 80%, you can see that the network is really struggling, and what it's doing is something which is definitely, in fact, right. In this case, my drawing is very precise. Sorry, my drawing is very precise, right? I mean, there are a few details, so it's a bit surrealistic, right? There's a kind of a string, with a roll of toilet paper and a shoe attached to a wall covered with newspaper. But maybe I just haven't figured out how to use Stable Diffusion properly. But what I get is something. This is a bit better because I told it I raised the sky and told it to put the Rembrandt skies in the background. So while these networks are amazing, right? While we can simulate the styles of hundreds of artists and every possible movement in medium art history, at least this particular technology at this stage actually is not able to simulate a very, let's say, more idiosyncratic, like less common style, more pessimistic style, more weird style of my own aesthetics. So I think this is exactly what I wanted to say. Thank you, Neil, for giving me the time, and hope we can discuss it.
Yeah, that's great. I want to just quickly show this this work by Weili Zhang. Just to go and add something into the pot, as it were. I just want to say that those watching on YouTube and Bilibili, please send in your questions. I want to kind of just once more then just share my screen, and I'll play this. It's about 4 minutes, I think it is. And I think what I want to say is it's really. I think what we're finding is that there are forms of kind of AI is never on its own. It seems it's been integrated into a series of other techniques, or at least these diffusion platforms are. I want to show you Weili Zhang's work, which is an interactive installation that is using AI. Beautiful, always as ever by Weili. Also, always beautiful work.
Man Ray, a significant contributor to Dada and Surrealism movements, invented the term real graph to describe his cameraless darkroom created photo images. He revealed the dreamlike characteristic of daily objects by placing them on the photosensitized paper and exposing them to light. His thrillographs are situated in between visual representations and abstractions, pointing to a new cameraless photographic method. Mary wrote in 1921 that he wanted to make my photography automatic, to use my camera as I would a typewriter. A reelograph is an image created by exposing light-sensitive photographic paper to light, where objects are placed on it to block areas of the paper. Variations of this technique are also implemented for scientific purposes, such as X-rays, which are made by using external radiation to produce images of our body. Today, we live under surveillance. Our life moments and our bodies have been captured, evaluated, and judged by the intelligent system behind the cameras. Image-making practices are beyond the merely taking in pictures that record light, such as operative images and generative images that emphasize on the instructional practices and autonomous systems. The notion of cameraless image-making process also shifted from reelograph to the rule-based activities and synchronic data-to-data relationship. Ray is an interactive AI art experience aims to address the changing ontology of the images under the gaze of machines by creating an intelligent system that incorporates automation with artistic originality to generate a visualization of a human-machine reality. Ray makes metaphors for the power of gaze by linking humans under surveillance cameras with objects for photograms. In the art installation, the intelligent system Ray constantly observes participants via camera and transforms the live streaming data to a novel semantic reelograph that evolves in real time. The intelligent system Ray mainly consists of two parts. Firstly, a generic image-to-image translation uses conditional adversarial networks. A neural network is trained to translate human portraits into new images of reelograph with semantic meanings through learning over 3,000 pairs of photograms and human portraits. Second part, a computer vision system is used to localize and describe the salient regions in the images in natural language. Descriptive sentences are generated in real time to describe the participants captured by the scanning camera installation. The generated moving images are further developed algorithmically through visualizing in the aesthetic of light painting. Ray engages audiences by transforming captured audience portraits into an ever-evolving visual representation that conveys meanings, which leads to new graphics of abstraction and empathy.
Right. Unfortunately, Wendy's not with us. I think she might be listening on YouTube. So if there are any questions, we can maybe relay them to us. So I want to just open up now into questions. Thank you so much for Aaron and Lev, and thank you, Wendy, also for these great presentations. And I think there's a lot to be discussed. I just want to make one observation first of all, in the sense that I think the three of us are in a similar situation. We've got a background in the two of you in the world of art, and myself in the world of architecture. I was trained as a designer, as an architect, and because of, I guess, pressures of work, it was kind of the theory took over and writing of books and things. But there is this kind of background, something which has been somehow enabled or unleashed by the new facilities that we have. And so we have a kind of a new kind of person, the kind of creative critic or something. I'm not quite sure how you describe that, but it always struck me as kind of interesting when we think about that model of the GAN, of these two different neural networks playing off against each other. That on the one hand, the discriminator, which is kind of the critic, as it were, is training the generator to be more critical about what it's generating. But there's also another relationship that's going on whereby the critic is also learning in some ways from the generator. And I often think that's how you might explain somehow the presence of people like Ben Bratton or Sampa Quinter, who are not architects, but are somehow drawn to this very creative sort of discipline. But it strikes me that over the years, Lev, and you and I, we've really been taking on board what's happening and been trained in some ways by the work that's been generated. And so, in some senses, what has happened is this new creature, maybe the creative discriminator, we could call it, has emerged, and it's able to do all these things, which is interesting. And I have a sudden new lease of life as a designer through what I can do through that. So it's just to make that observation. But I want to sort of pick up on a couple of points. First of all, I want to go and ask Lev. I was just struck by the comment you made about artificial aesthetics. Can you have an artificial aesthetics? I mean, I guess I think Ben Bratton uses the term synthetic intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. I don't like the term artificial intelligence. There's nothing artificial about it, but definitely synthetic. In any case, where do you draw the line between something that is produced by another technology and AI? What makes it artificial in any way, or is it just simply an allusion to AI?
Okay, I also like the term synthetic. In fact, if we look, we'll see that the technical name for this field of research is AI image synthesis, right? So AI or computer synthesizes images. Well, so the main kind of point, I mean, I know I made a few points, right? The key point of my talk relevant to the discussion is that there is such a, in fact, there is a, AI aesthetics. Let's say there is a, what I mean by this is this, right? So a computer by itself has no aesthetics, right? Since people started doing digital art in the early 60s, right, there has been attempts to define, is there some aesthetic specific to a computer? And some people would kind of refer to Marshall McLuhan, who said, the content of a new medium in the beginning is always old media. People said, well, right now the computer is imitating kind of painting and drawing, and one day it will emerge with something unique. But it sort of makes no sense, this argument, right? Because as Aaron beautifully discussed, right? Artists, creators, designers, craftspeople, because we're no artists until the 18th century. It's craftspeople were using different technological media throughout human history, and the aesthetics came from them, right? Although the tools had some effect. So by default, the computer can't have aesthetics. The aesthetics come from algorithms somebody writes, or from training data sets, or from architecture of neural networks, right? And as I try to show by going through this aesthetics data set, which is a part of this, 5 billion image text pair, so it's a few hundred million images, which were evaluated by the aesthetic model, which itself reflects the aesthetic judgments of contemporary, let's say, Western and popular culture. There's a very particular aesthetics which then gets built into the tools, which reflect particular likes of particular types of people in a particular historical moment, right? And once in a while, when you use these tools, this particular aesthetics comes out, right? If we take these tools, we train them on the aesthetic preferences of kind of high-end architects, or artists in India, or I don't know, other groups, something else will emerge. And one thing which I think we're hoping should happen in the next few years is there should be more data sets, released or created, which will have different aesthetic biases, right? So the idea is not to get rid of aesthetic bias, the idea is to have different data sets and then understand, with particular aesthetic biases. And the last thing I want to say, and maybe Aaron will have different opinion, but I read thousands of computer science papers in areas such as artificial aesthetics, computer vision, and so on. And I think not many computer scientists, and maybe Aaron is probably one of the, part of a small exceptions, really aware, right, about the differences between contemporary high art and kind of popular art. So there is a research in psychology of art, right, sociology of art, and they give people images and people evaluate them. And yeah, when most people think about art, we think about craft, the ability to create realistic representations right? So maybe, but not only realism, something like Van Gogh, right? Something like post-impressionism. So in this test, systematically people rate abstract images as less aesthetic or less artistic, right? Because we think, okay, the computer can do it. You know, but I think growing number of computer scientists are becoming aware of these issues. So what we need is we need more data sets and more systems which we use them, which are trained to reflect aesthetic preferences of a variety of different groups of people on this planet. So that's my comment.
Maybe I could just ask you a question, Aaron. So I was really struck by, I thought what was really beautiful about your paper is, well, many beautiful things, super clear, thank you so much. But there was one thing that really, about that graph where you showed where people were, there was a certain period in your life when you're more receptive and you kind of look back on that, and that's the dominant sort of, I think it was 14 or onwards. It was super interesting as a kind of commentary and things. And it struck me that, I've often thought about this, about, how do you deal with a kind of cultural production, which is shifting and changing and developing according to different paradigms. It doesn't say it's static, it develops in a new way. And there is a kind of comment that Jean-François Lyotard makes about this, which is to say, we have to judge, but we have to judge according to ever-evolving parameters. And of course, you could say, well, that sounds like it's relativist and so on, but it strikes me that that's exactly the kind of the challenge. And it's so easy to fall back on what you know and to judge things based on what you know. But as things are evolving, the kind of the way in which they're framed and thereby generated according to shifting cultural values is continually changing. So it was like, I've always thought that kind of Lyotard sort of kind of exhortation to judge, but not to judge on any sort of fixed standards of the past, is the challenge that we face right now. And I'm just wondering, I don't know, I would throw that at you as a kind of comment, because I think it seems to me you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of kind of, how do you get beyond this kind of the bias by which we brought up by. I mean, I was also struck by the kind of the response that you might get from people like sort of Prince Charles, right? I mean, super conservative. He's always sort of looking at the current generation and criticizing them. They can't spell, they can't add up. They're like this Beavis and Butter generation of whatever. But actually, what you can find in this kind of Beavis and Butter generation is a whole series of new skills of multitasking. And do we need to spell? We've got spell check. Do we need to add up? We have calculators out. And it's really, that is the challenge, is how do you judge things according to a framework where you maintain that criticism, but you're not constrained by a set of values that may be now a little bit obsolete. Could I just maybe throw that to you to see what you think about that comment?
Yeah, these are super interesting questions. It's definitely ones I wonder about a lot. Excuse me. I think, a lot of the reason to talk about cognitive biases is not that we are incapable of making good judgments. It's more to recognize a lot of the pitfalls that we may fall into. If people say everything today is terrible, it's worth, that's sort of a knee-jerk response that it's easy to have. But if you reflect on it, you may recognize, well, maybe it's just my preferences are different from what has happened today. But I still think it's worth understanding these changes, because there are potential harms to technology. There are trends in the world that are definitely bad and negative. It's just that they may not be the obvious ones that appear if you don't reflect upon them. So, one sort of trend that Lev pointed out in his books that I really liked, he pointed out the influence that Instagram may have on people's tastes and preferences, as well as the way that smartphone cameras use a lot of really intelligent algorithms to make all of our pictures look good in a very particular way. And so there are algorithms built by human designers with some combination of machine learning and training, or hand-coded visual aesthetic preferences that are really, in a way, governing a lot of our aesthetics. And there's something in psychology called the mere exposure effect, that just by seeing a lot of the same kind of thing, you start to like it more. And so I think it's worth thinking about the degree to which these algorithms and algorithm designers are making choices that influence our aesthetic culture. We always have to have aesthetic culture. There are always aesthetic choices and preferences, but it's important to understand where they come from. And they're not necessarily coming from people writing DALL-E. There's these hidden things that are maybe not well understood.
maybe I could just pick up on that briefly. We've got some questions coming in. After this, I want to ask Lila. She's got a couple of questions, and also Lubitsa. But just one, I guess what I've noticed with Midjourney is that somehow you find yourself coming back to this to very similar aesthetics. And I noticed this when I was it became very easy to generate an Iranian and Persian interior, right? And it was almost set up by the system. But then I tried to do an Arabic interior, and it looked almost identical. And I see certain dominant modalities or expressions. And I don't know whether that's been prescribed in some way by somebody who's writing something into the algorithm, or whether it's simply the system itself gets locked into particular things. What might that be? I mean, it happens also maybe with faces. Sometimes you get a particular face that keeps reappearing.
We can only speculate, but I think certainly with that particular system, but a lot of these systems end up being this sort of combination of, you write a tool, you fit some data, you curate the data set, and then it has a particular look or particular set of things it does. And so at some point, either they iterated on that or they said, okay, this is good enough. And so at a point, their designers' high-level decisions dictated that, but it may not have been a conscious choice to do that. They might have said, this looks good, we're happy with the results at some point.
Okay. Did you want to say something there?
Well, very briefly. So, because we had a bit of a side discussion going in chat, and I said, try to make it very black and white. I said, but ultimately, what you see, like millions of people generating with tools, it's not reflection of any kind of AI aesthetics. It's not reflection of architectures networks. It is in some extent, but 90% it's reflection of popular taste, which is trained by Hollywood sci-fi movies, and also sci-fi movies, big budget, right, action films done around the world, by video games, by anime, manga, and it's basically what's called concept art, right? So concept art is a profession of artists who create sketches, content, design of characters, designs of backgrounds for all these different popular visual form. And it's quite similar to what you see on ArtStation. ArtStation, right, is a portfolio site where all the game industry people hang out. I mean, or like all the wannabe game industry people hang out. So it's very important, right, not to limit this discussion to talking about like aesthetics and AI aesthetics and networks, because 90% influence comes from outside, right? So that's, I think, very important. Of course, what maybe some like architecture students are doing, right, or what you're doing, what I'm doing is different, but we're like really exceptions to this kind of great universe of millions of people. And then, of course, one thing I want to say, so the way Midjourney say we operate is that we see what kind of images people make and what images people like, and then this goes back to train the system. So when this taste, which comes from kind of, basically, let's put it this way, right? Yes, it's true that hip hop and various bottom-up movements have influenced culture in the last 40 years. So the influence comes from below, but still most of the influence comes up, right? So most of the influence comes from big video games, from manga, from anime, from Hollywood and Hollywood like from K-pop. And then because people create this kind of images when we use the system, when these aesthetic choices get incorporated in the next generations of networks, now Aaron knows much more about architecture, right? So to what extent, like what has more weight, I don't know, but definitely, I mean, this is actually the most dangerous thing. But there is this kind of loop, right? But when Hollywood produces something, people like it. We try to produce something similar, even the system learns it, and then it just goes on. But in the same time, the last thing I want to say, right, is the most important question for me in talking about the system was a question of diversity. Just because the systems can get trained to simulate this particular Hollywood taste, it does not mean that the aesthetics will converge to that. Because as we saw from this DALI handbook, the system has been trained on billions, right? Billions of image text pairs. So it has learned everything about human art history. So if you just push it a little bit, it can also create something very different. But most people, right, may not push it, right? So maybe it's about also educating people to use the system like in a more creative way, to give it some strange prompts and so on. So there's so the last thing. So on the one hand, we can expect almost like a little convergence, but at the same time, there's a divergence as long as the training set's big enough. So it's a very complex process. It's fascinating, but let's just remember that the key factor in driving AI aesthetics is not the architecture of neural networks or training set. It's really outside forces like Hollywood, ArtStation, and game industry.
Aaron, you were nodding your head. Do you want to say something, or right, move on? Or
no, I think that's exactly. It makes sense. I think some people have raised the concern that the aesthetics will converge, and I don't really believe that. Like throughout history, we have fashions, we have disco becomes popular and then becomes everywhere, and people get sick of it, and then punk is a response to that, and people get sick of the excesses of punk, and we have post-punk and new wave music. And I think that this sort of feedback loop is good in that it creates culture that develops, and then people get sick of it in response to, and then there's just a concern of, as how much freedom there is in the system for new bottom-up movements to exist, as opposed to being prevented by the system, which I think is an interesting topic.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking there's an article by an interview with David Holtz, the kind of CEO of Midjourney, where he does make the comment that he doesn't really understand why it is, but the system tends to shift towards certain colors and things, orange and whatever. I certainly find that. Anyway, let's open up some questions.
Sorry, but he actually said we train the system to create particular aesthetics. Even he said like what? He said, well, by default, the system will give you like kind of greenish and greenish and orange colors. And why? This is the color aesthetics of Hollywood. This is how most Hollywood films, are being colorized. So again, it's like I think he knows more than he says, right? So we basically build it by default to make a Hollywood type image. So sorry to interrupt, but I just want to push this for the sociological.
No, it's fantastic. Thank you, Lev. So Lila, you'd like to ask your question. Lila, I should say, is currently on the FIU DDes. She originally was studied at SciArc and then was teaching at Tongji at the Design and Innovation Department. Lila, welcome. You've got two questions. Would you like to unmute yourself?
I have the first question for both speakers. So it seems in both of your presentation telling us that technology and tools, so the artists are mere users and followers of technology and treating them as tools, and no matter how creative they are. But currently more and more design school, like my own school and also at FIU, so the school are teaching coding, robotics, and other technology to designers, and making them the core curriculum. What do you think what does it mean for the future when artists and designers are also coders and programmers or engineers? What's the tech and cultural landscape is gonna be when the next generation of artists knows how to create their own tools?
I guess I can comment. I'm going to say like a lot of the excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. A lot of the early innovators in all of these different kinds of technologies were people who were both doing art and technology. Early photographers and Walt Disney and Catmull were people who were both doing the technology and the art together. And a lot of the computer art history, like people who write code and processing, people have been doing art with coding, and Lev talked about his own experience here as well. I think that the thing that I'm most excited about is to see people who are more computer literate as an audience for this art form can better appreciate the art that coders make, that can develop. And I think computer art in the past has kind of been held up a bit by people not really understanding what it means to make art using computers. And so I think the presence of that audience, I think, is going to be the most positive effect for this kind of art.
You have a second question, Lila, unless Lev wants to make a comment on that one.
The second question is for Lev. So your book, Software Takes Command, is really powerful and inspirational for me. It shows how software shapes creators' workflow and mind in the digital age. So you also mentioned control as you were manipulating your Photoshop photos. It seems like you think the process of creation should be conscious and controlled. So do you agree that the current AI tools are not controllable because they are not using the consciousness of the creators? Do you think art creation should be a conscious process? What does the subconscious nature of AI bring to the art design world? And also, when both process and result are not 100% controlled by the artist, what does that mean? Does that mean you don't own the work? Or I actually don't want to bring the authorship topic here. I just want to talk about pure conscious.
Yeah. Thank you for your very clear and very important question. So we often talk about intuition, right? Unconscious. And basically, one of the reasons I have this career is that I kind of try to make decisions which are based on my intuition, what my intuition tells me. Because I think intuition is simply another form of consciousness, right? It's another form of calculation. But when you try to decide, like, should I go to this, design school, or should I move to that country, or should I marry this person, right? You kind of write things on paper. You try to make some simple calculations or evaluations. And when your intuition tells you do this, right? So intuition simply means your brain probably has much more complex calculations using more data. So you don't know how this calculation happens, but often, right, intuition tells you better things. So when it comes to the, design, right, filmmaking, art, and so on, so people develop different processes to try to kind of blank, right, to try to take out the consciousness, right, the rational process out of the equation, right? For example, surrealists had this technique, right? Or like Francis Bacon, the famous British painter, who would paint portrait, and then he would take a piece of cloth with paint and just kind of throw, right, etc. And when people started to use algorithms in the 60s, they realized very quickly that there's a wonderful things where you can add some noise, right, into the algorithm, right? So generate kind of squares on a square, canvas, but at random positions, right? And wonderful 1960s arts are full of it. So every technology, so actually most technologies have their own way to bring randomness and to allow you not to control them. And I actually use it every day. I mean, every day when I use stable diffusion. So stable diffusion has this parameter called scale, which goes from 1 to 20. So if you set it to like 15 to 20, you get exactly what you specify in your prompt. So images are very precise, and they're usually aesthetically incredibly boring, right? We're like bad photographs. We're like DALL-E images. So with default setting is 7, and actually the best images which I was able to create, I set this parameter to anywhere from 0 to 3, which means that my input, like whatever I type in my prompt, even if it's strange, actually plays a significantly less role in generation. So what I actually get is something, right, let's say less defined, blurry, kind of surreal, strange, weird from a network, right? So that's a wonderful way in which you can kind of bring less control to the networks. And finally, when I said that it's hard to control the systems, I think all of us who use the system know that sometimes you type a prompt and you get more or less what you wanted. Sometimes you type a prompt and it's almost like the system knows exactly what you want. And sometimes you type a prompt and you just can't get anything like this. So for months, I was trying to simply make a composition, which is what I used to draw when I was studying for architecture school, like a cylinder, a cube, and a sphere on the table. And I can't get the system to do that because it doesn't understand about spatial relationships. So that's what I mean. It's and you actually never know beforehand if it's going to work or not. So my way around it, right, was basically to realize after a while, don't try to do exactly what you want. Think of an interesting prompt, even set the scale parameter to a very low value, where 90% of what you get is something which comes out from trillions of weights, so basically by not trying to control the system, I was able to get more interesting images. So But if you're architect, right, who wants to use it, and I see all these architects on Instagram, like Neil, who trying to get something very definite, that becomes a problem, right? Because people want to make a particular facade, et cetera, but maybe with kind of very blurry, like, right, architecture, you know, which comes out if you set parameter low, maybe that's what we'll have to build. Maybe we have to build with like moon-like, right? Moon-like kind of like mountains. Maybe that is the future, or maybe that is the aesthetics of AI which we want to follow.
No, I just wanted to comment on that. I mean, what struck me is actually, I've not had an office of practice for so many years now, but I actually enjoy what I can do on that. But I've on Midjourney and so on. But I've noticed that those who are designers, who've got a reputation of an office, often don't really try and engage with design as such. They go for quirky results or something like that. And it's kind of interesting because I think you have to relinquish control. You know, you can't really take it in a certain sort of way. And I start off looking for something and end up going in a completely different direction, ending up with something completely accidental. And I think that's maybe something that's maybe, I don't know, I'm just guessing, it's hard for somebody who's so used to being in control of the design process. Just a speculation.
Thank you.
Maybe one thing. Okay, so one thing I just want to say very briefly. So one of the things which I do hate, and this is Aaron, don't take it personally, which I hate about all the digital tools, you know, maybe it is Photoshop, Illustrator, or whatever, is that it's a very particular creation process where you have to be in control. Okay, now I'm selecting this tool. Now I'm making this selection. Now I'm using this filter, right? So I actually don't know how to like, take a cloth of paint and throw at the canvas. And that's why actually, after 30 years of being digital, this summer I kind of went back to starting to make drawings. When I make drawings, I also control them, but in a kind of different way. So, I mean, I know, I'm sure this is not what Adobe is going to come out like in the next few months, but I wonder if there's maybe any, you know, you see any research in the industry or in computer science, how do we make computer tools which allow you to create without being so anal, so specific? Because this can be actually, I think with AI is one way by setting scale parameter, but I think it's a larger question, and I think the same things will go to architecture, right? I mean, I don't use Houdini because it's so anal, right? It's like I have to. It's more anal. You know, why do all the architects, at least in public, we make these beautiful sketches, right, on a napkin? Because that's a different way. And when sketches turn into architecture, right? So there's a whole way we have to maybe think about the different paradigm for all digital tools, how to kind of get them from this anal stage.
Yeah, I think those are really deep questions that like we know how to build tools that solve a specific problem. We don't know how to make something which is exploratory and creative without being too tied into the very specific aesthetics of that tool. And that's what's been so exciting about playing with things like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion, is that they enable these long creative exploratory journeys that we didn't anticipate, that seem just like very unpredictable and yet feel very, very creative in ways that seem similar to our other creative practices.
And maybe it's just that I think the Midjourney is much looser. You know, it's less prescribed, and therefore opens up the possibility of more flexibility, shall we say? You know, I find that somehow DALL-E is too precise in some way. We have a question from Felice Grodin. Felice is a graduate of GSD, an artist in Miami, and also on the DDes. Felice.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Neil. Great presentations. You know, I'm happy to hear the sort of issue of bias coming up sort of throughout the presentations. And it's interesting, Neil, because the example you showed, Mario Kleinman, am I saying that correctly? I mean, that piece, to me, you could write a paper about that piece just based on that alone, because essentially there's a binary, you know, the kind of gender establishment of the male, the female in that piece. And just the kind of data sets that are used to produce those results. I mean, you could go down a rabbit hole right there. So, I mean, I kind of bookend that to the last example you showed, and I can't remember her name, Wendy or?
Wendy Zhang. Well,
Wendy Zhang.
Whitey, W-E-I-D-I. Yeah.
Where she's in fact using the kind of the kind of data set of the observer to produce this kind of I think she said at the end of her presentation that there was something in the abstraction, something that was potential in the abstraction, a kind of emancipatory moment in that abstraction. So I guess I'm trying to bookend these two pieces to kind of direct my question to both of you, of the panelists today, is how, you know, on one hand, the data sets obviously have to become more expansive, because as creative as we want to say these tools are, that's the interesting kind of paradox for me about using stable diffusion anyway, is that they're based on the content that's put into these black boxes. But on the other hand, you guys are describing ways around that. You know, Lev, you particularly are just describing processes by which maybe there's a level of abstraction that eludes the kind of limitations, right? But my question is this: is abstraction enough, because these technologies are so pervasive on almost a pop cultural level at this point? You know, could there be a kind of perception of challenge through abstraction? Or might there be just other things that have to happen, Aaron, kind of what you're saying as far as time, that through time, these things will become more expansive in terms of what goes into them. So I just thought I would allow you guys to just kind of respond in kind. Thank you.
So I think the data sets for these things are actually quite broad, but bias emerges from what's popular in the data sets. And I know in context, you know, all data sets have bias. It's more a question of designing what that bias is and finding ways to work around it. As all cultures have preferences and biases. And so it's a lot of it is about how do we create mechanisms or, you know, judgments for what biases we like or we don't like, and tools that will let people explore the things that they want to explore without guiding them towards a very narrow view of the world. And that's, you know, as I mentioned with Lev's discussion of Instagram, there's sort of these subtle biases that are maybe people are less aware of in algorithmic content curation. I don't know if that responds to your question, but that's my first thought about it.
Well, I think I'm speaking too much on this panel, so Neil, I hope will forgive me. But so very briefly, so abstraction is, you know, so as I said, like I'm using the scale parameter of stable diffusion. I think Midjourney also has like a noise parameter, which I haven't explored, which in a way makes results, let's say, less clear, less like illustration, right? Less concept art. But I also want to say in general, with abstraction, I think is not the answer, because first of all, every kind of abstract image was already explored by artists in the 20th century. And also, you know, at a certain point, right, like in American art schools, right, you know, education moves from like realism, you know, figuration and craft to expressing yourself, right? You know, so you're 17-year-old, you become like junior, you know, freshman college, and you say, express yourself. Well, what are you going to express except what you've seen on TV, video games you played, right? So it's a big question, right? But the point is like this, you know, if you, let's say millions of artists today making abstract paintings, but, you know, Aaron knows how to do it. I know not as well, but together we can do it. We can take all these abstract paintings and kind of like, and classify them into, you know, maybe a dozen clusters, right? By similarity, maybe 8 clusters, maybe 15 clusters. So because, you know, when you use any media, right, whether it is Instagram or Paint, you simulate, right? You basically follow other people, right? Ernest Gombrich, the most important historian of the 20th century, pointed out that artists don't start from scratch. You basically paint the kind of templates, right? You paint the grass in a particular way, which is so other artists, before you paint the grass, right? You don't draw a tree like in some original way, right? And very, very few people are able to bring out of it. So, you know, there's always going to be a dozen people in any field, you know, who are like truly innovative, and then, you know, millions of people who are okay, even billions of people who are just bad. Maybe it is medicine, you know, car mechanics, art, or computer science, because lots of computer science papers just kind of, in a way, just do a little bit of research and copy what somebody already done, right? Once somebody has original paper. So in a way, I think abstraction is not the answer, because, you know, very, very few people are going to be truly innovative. And I'm not sure that, so the question becomes, can AI tools make more people truly innovative, not creative, right? Because, but actually creative, really creative. And do we actually need this, right? Does the world need more creativity? Does the world need less creativity? why every website today in the world has a different design. It's waste my time. If I was modernist, I would say, let's approve as humanity 4 types of designs for websites. And when I go to websites, I know how. Okay, why do we need always architects designing new buildings? Most of them is shit. Why not take 50 best buildings of the 20th century, by Le Corbusier, and this and that, and just milking copies? It will make for much better architecture, right? So my thing is that I want. Okay, so this is a bit of a devil's advocate. I want technology to make us less creative, so we create less bad stuff.
I think that's a very provocative point. I must say that I think that I would ask the question: why do we have a limited number of cars, or indeed a limited number of iPhones, colors, or whatever it is, and yet every single building has to be different? I mean, that's in history it hasn't been. There have been certain sort of stock buildings. This is a great discussion.
I found an example where we all used to be different 10 years ago, and then they all became copyright of this kind of just of iPhone. So in some areas of society we have to inject more creativity. Other areas we have to reduce it.
No, that's great. That's what I like about you, Lev. You're full of also your criticism of creativity itself in a previous on the AD and so on. So we've got a couple of questions from the chat. Here's also a couple of questions coming in from YouTube. I want to ask, first of all, Gustavo, if he'd like to ask his question and unmute himself. And then I'm going to ask Deepti, and we've got a couple of other questions coming in from the YouTube chat. Gustavo.
So, hello. Thank you, Neil, and great presentations, Lev and Aaron. I think I've been kind of writing so many things in the chat, but mostly it seems as though that what I really appreciated about today was looking at the kind of the edges. Lev brought up an interesting point about if the databases are driven by let's say concept artists in Hollywood, or let's say they're being scraped in a certain type of databases. I'm not sure if they're paid or free, but where then we're trapped in that type of narrative, that type of imagination of time, it seems. But what about all the locked data that we have in the libraries of books? And how do we engage that larger conversation where some of the problems that we encounter are so huge that we need to get beyond the concept art or the derivative of art? And my experience in Hollywood is very limited, but what I do know in concept art is that it's very rare for someone in that profession to have studied decades in the arts and understands the theory or the history behind it. So they're basically remixing. And I think that's another type of awareness or instinct. So I think for both of you, where do you see the future? And I think it goes to Aaron and then Lev. Where do you see the future of these type of tools tackling larger problems like climate change, or tackling something like looking at a different star system? So I'm thinking through like scientific visualization or trying to understand where we are in society right now.
Well, the computer tools, right? Data science tools, AI tools are used in every area of society. And in fact, the whole research about climate change would not be possible without big data, predictive models and so on. If you look at various, data science or big data conferences, there's many panels about data for good. They're used by nonprofits. For example, you use computational tools to estimate various economic life in certain countries or demography in certain countries, which don't publish their statistics. So people use satellite imagery in trying to predict the economic and demographic, right, and kind of parameters from how much light there is in a particular country at night. But you shouldn't expect that every single tool in the world will be about climate change. I draw with a pencil. Pencil is not about climate change. Pencil is about me imagining, drawing, and sketching things, right? So I don't know why we need to ask, Midjourney to, tackle climate change, because there are plenty of computer scientists and plenty of computer tools, whether it is data visualization, or so on, right? So, but for example, any of these tools, like any of these techniques, like like cluster analysis or T-SNE or etc., can be used for anything, whether it is to make art or tackle climate change. And I just want to point out, that without data and computation, it would not be possible. It wouldn't be possible to study climate change. It wouldn't be possible to predict what to do. So, in fact, I'm very, very much impressed how these tools are used for good. So I'm not sure where you get this urgency from. Maybe I don't get something.
I would point to Sofia Crespo, who Neil mentioned as an example of an artist using AI tools as to discuss climate change. So it's sort of an example. These are in a way just like the new paintbrushes that could be used for commenting on any topic. I do think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that they are very relevant to urgent societal issues around the use of AI algorithms in various contexts, and that's something where they're very directly relevant. I also want to comment on one other thing, which is I think there's sometimes a discussion of when you say I'm making a picture in the style of Van Gogh or some artist, that you're sort of making the same thing that Van Gogh did or Bosch or whomever. And I really don't think that's the case. I think these tools are generative art tools. People are writing code that is doing some combination of algorithms and convolutions and networks and remixing information from data sets. And so when you say make a landscape in the style of Van Gogh or someone else, you are not making a Van Gogh picture. You're not making a painting that he did. You're making a generative computer generated artwork that has a completely different context and visual style and cultural meaning than those original paintings did. It's basically a different kind of art than concept art it was trained on.
Just one more thing. So I didn't want to spend my 25 minutes by only showing my AI images, but I did say, I did talk a bit about the context when I showed these images of like Russian students. But in general, many of my, quite a number of image series, I created and published since the summer had to do with war and my kind of emotional response to a war and the strange, absurd feeling I feel where I left Russia in 1980, right? And in 1990, you have the end of communism, and for 30 years, people were building new society, new culture. I've been to Russia 17 times since 2015 and 20, and Russia has become really the avant-garde cultural place of Europe. All the top avant-garde theater directors, would go to Russia, and now it's all been erased within, few days. And I've been also trying to think about how I can make images which would talk about climate change, but not in a very obvious way, right? I don't want to simply show a landscape with city, like people hiding from heat, something a bit more metaphorical. And I tried and I haven't figured out how to do that. But so now I do agree with Gustavo Alfonso that we can also use these tools, and we should use these tools to reflect on important political issues, or we can make abstract art, or we can paint still lifes, right? People are free to do whatever we want. And sometimes, right, I'm very nervous about only doing art which deals with social issues, because all official art in Soviet Union was about that. And people wanted to get away from this. So I learned how painting a still life or painting landscape can be also political, precisely because I don't put any political message into it, right? So I'm trying to occupy both positions. So thank you for your questions.
Just one last question, just to follow up, but where do you see our educational system or industry failing or succeeding when it comes to these tools? How do we educate? How do we educate a scholar? Because it seems as though that when at least at the University of California, Santa Barbara, our computer scientists are trained technically, and they're beautifully, let's say they understand every technical detail, but with ethics or philosophy, they get a donut, and then in the arts, we're trying to move into the technical realm, but there's not a deep understanding. where do you both see this type of, how do we get this type of literacy, computational literacy, and this kind of ethics or philosophy built in? And I think I'm talking to Lev here as a pioneer here, in education. What do you think?
Well, I think Aaron should also respond in a second, since he kind of represents, computer science. And again, he's an amazing example. Sorry, Aaron, I'm calling you example. I hope it's not offensive, right? I think he's amazing that, on the one hand, doing really cutting edge and being very productive in computer science, but also obviously having, he gave my lecture today, right? He gave a lecture about kind of media history, media theory. Well, so thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. So as you know, those of us who've been doing digital arts our whole lives have been talking exactly about these issues. So how do we educate art, design, architecture students, giving them more technical, computational kind of knowledge? And also how do we get computer scientists to have more of a humanities knowledge, right? And I would say in particular, people who are like Aaron's colleague, right, who are working with visual tools or creative tools. Yeah, it would be ideal if we know more about our history and also, like basic things. But we're no artists until Enlightenment, right? We're no artists until Romantic period, right? The modern idea of art begins like in 1750 to 80. So when people talk about, all artists were creative, that's nonsense, right? Because for 99% of human history, creativity did not even exist. There was no term creativity, it was no term art. It was about, right, doing good things, imitating, right? You imitate, like you basically train from your workshop master, right? You go to Rubens and you paint like, as of a horse in every painting, even you become your own Rubens. And yet somehow, even though there was no talk about creativity, there was no concept of art, people created the most amazing things, right? That's a paradox. But to get back to you, I think at this point, and this is hard to say, I think there are more people who are doing art, or at least like they think they're doing art, who understand kind of enough computer science. As Aaron knows, right, lots of innovations in this development from Deep Dream to today. It was, of course, all of it was computer scientists, but artists have also pushed forward. So there are probably more people in culture and arts who have enough understanding of computer science. And I think there are less people in computer science or data science who have like enough humanities understanding. That's my feeling. But of course, it's very hard to measure. But I'm just thinking about, like thousands of papers I read. And of course, there's an exception of the papers, which are also very deep in humanities and computer science. But with papers, there's more of them slowly, but there's still exceptions. So anyway, but Aaron should definitely talk.
Yeah, so like it's been many years since I used to be a computer science professor, but certainly all throughout all my education and work as a professor, there's very much the view of computer science education is to teach you to build tools, and how those things get used by society is kind of not your problem. And I think we're really seeing the limitations of that view today, with people where computer science is having such a huge impact on the world, and AI techniques that were sort of not anticipated or sort of not foreseen or not really viewed as our problem. And I see it in a way, part of it is kind of like, at least here in the US, there's kind of two views of what the purpose of education is. One view is to build citizens who are engaged and understand the world, or to educate good citizens. And the other view is to train workers to improve the economy. And I feel like so much of the education has focused on that latter thing, and getting people are concerned about whether they'll get jobs and make a good income. And so much of the education is just, can I build the things that will, learn the skills that will get me a job, and not what are the impacts and relationship I will have on the world.
I just want to add, so I think, people who work in a company like Adobe, right? People who build, new tools for Photoshop, etc. They're actually having more effect on visual culture than anybody else in the world, because this is what going to be used by, tens of millions of people. And of course, sometimes Adobe refers, and then our software will copy. So I imagine somebody, right, who's sitting there, like, hopefully not in a cubicle, but in a nice open office. I actually never been inside Adobe. I would love to visit one day, and working on the next generation of, automatic, subject, selection tool. this is basically like a circumventing perspective, right? So I would love one day to visit, to talk to people and not to look down at them, not at all, but just to get a better understanding, how much we know. And also, I mean, how do you bring, like, let's say, more sophisticated understanding of contemporary culture to these engineers who are geniuses in their own right? But as you said, it's not their fault. We were just never trained. We were never trained in these subjects, and we don't really, you are exceptional. Somehow you educated yourself, right? And but most people around you are probably not like that. So how do we kind of get? So in fact, we don't have to educate all computer scientists, but people who work in Adobe, right? People who work in Midjourney. How do we help them to get a bit more education about contemporary culture, about postmodernism, about history of art, and which may somehow affect, what's going to be like, in the Photoshop 36 or Photoshop 45, which will in fact affect, and the same thing is Midjourney, right? Like I can almost want to take the founder and just lock him in a room and give him like, art history lectures, because what this company is going to do is really affecting the world. So that's my question.
Yeah, and I also want to mention that I think there is now a very broad movement to bring ethics education into computer science programs. And like I know a bunch of schools where people are doing this. And I think, so, now the question is like, what exactly does that look like? What topics do you talk about? And, I think, I don't want to, say that computer science is solely at fault. I think a lot of the humanities field, certainly in the postmodern era has been extremely hostile to science. I mean, I think of like Bruno Latour's work has had a lot of valuable insights about the production of knowledge, but it's also been, not accessible to science curriculum or potentially valuable to that. So figuring out how to bridge that gap, I think, will be very important.
I just wanted to thank both of you for your answers, and I just wanted to say thank you, Lev, for your time, and Aaron and Neil, as always. Incredibly stimulating Sunday.
We haven't finished yet, Gustav. I just want to mention, I mean, just on this last discussion, let me just say briefly that my question is not how to educate the students, but how do you educate the educators? I can't tell you how many emails I get from students who said that I raised this question in class and I just got dismissed by the professor, and nobody's addressing all these issues, especially AI. And I get shocked and educated by my own students. I mean, just recently I got an AI generated essay. Well, it was a video actually, but it was completely AI generated. And they used three models. Well, first of all, to generate the text. Then they used another AI platform to get a human to articulate it. And then they put the text through Midjourney or something and got images. Unbelievable. So I'm being educated the whole time by my own students. We've got a question from Deepti and a couple in the chat. If we can squeeze them in quickly. Deepti, would you like to ask your question? We can't hear you. Can you get to it? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much to both of you for the wonderful conversation today. I learned a lot. I just wanted to ask that every time in any community when we talk about AI and art, there's a lot of question always about data bias. Where is the data coming from? What is the kind of bias you have given the system, and what is the kind of discriminator? Sometimes just to myself, I think, okay, if all these questions were put aside, I can finally tell them what I'm trying to do with the tool and what I'm trying to say with the kind of art generation of art that I'm trying to create with these tools like Midjourney or DALL-E. So I want to ask both of you, once this dust settles down, once everybody is okay with the bias and discrimination that's inbuilt with the AI, and like also Aaron was mentioning in his presentation, tools which came about in terms of photography or film, etc., didn't receive this criticism. It received a different kind of criticism, probably because the bias and discrimination was only coming from the human being and not from the tool itself. And now, because it's coming from the tool, it's receiving a lot of criticism. But once that kind of settles in, what is the kind of conversation that we should have? Like, let's say all this is settled and we don't have to talk about it anymore. What is the kind of quality of conversation we can start having about the future of AI and art or creation with using this tool of AI? What is an ideal conversation? Do you ever think about what would be a great conversation?
I think we're having a great conversation. I'm not sure how much better it will get, but also I want to say, the dust will never settle. The reason new media is called new media, as I said, right? Because by its nature, it's a software, so it's very easy to create new things, right? I think in my book, The Software Takes Command, I talk about it, right? But new media will always remain new media because, for example, once you build railroad, right, it's very, takes lots of money to change, the width, right, of a track. Or once Hollywood got settled on particular kind of film cameras, etc., it's very hard. With software, in theory, you can change it any day. Of course, once people settled on certain format like JPEG or PDF, it's also not going to change. But the software world does have lots of creativity because anybody can come in and write some code, right? And et cetera. Although right now with AI, because it does cost so much to train these models on billions of images or billions of books, it is very costly. But hopefully this will come down. I think in terms of the bias in search engines, right? Where for particular searches it brings you white people or black people, etc. Yes, I think this is going to settle. I think once the media kind of brought people attention to it, the computer scientists are kind of smart. In fact, they're smarter than us in terms of IQ just measurement. So I think we very quickly noticed that. And I think that's being addressed, and I think this will get settled. But in terms of art and architecture design, I mean, what would be a system which doesn't have bias, right? Or that's a very interesting question, right? So I think what we want to do is we want to have more data sets where we have very particular biases, but the public, the scientist says, okay, here's a data set, and it's going to generate this image as opposed to that's a bias, right? The problem is that when computer scientists or data scientists create data sets, and we're like, well, we just trained it on 5 billion images, we don't know what's where, and then it turns out it's 30% Pinterest. So biases are okay. In fact, I would love to have data set which is only trained to generate particular images as opposed to anything else. And I would like to see what I can do with it, as long as the biases are made explicit. And the last thing I want to say, so I was talking to somebody recently, and he said, I'm on a jury of architecture competition in China. In China, right, it's like the West multiplied by 20, right? So competition had thousands of teams. And we actually built, we built neural network to automatically judge the competition because there's just too many entries because it's China. And then we actually built the bias to make sure it doesn't select too many entries from Beijing and Shanghai, right? Because maybe with entries from top cities were sometimes more sophisticated. So we actually build a bias so the network would maybe rate even higher people from a smaller provincial schools. So biases can be also a very good thing. Don't think of them as always as a bad thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think the conversation really is happening. A lot of people are having these very interesting debates around these things and bringing up bias in quite a lot of the cases. I think one point I want to make in this conversation in general is that these issues have been around in technologies for a long time in different forms. And part of the challenge is to figure out how these new technologies are encoding these biases in different ways. And I think my favorite example is from a paper by Lorna Roth about photography, and our film photography has been very much designed to make skin look good. In particular, Kodak for 50 years was making white skin look good, and they didn't really care about any other kind of skin color. And so it really affected the way film photography for decades would reproduce skin color in ways that exhibited very clear biases. And so, and I reviewed a lot of the fact that these sorts of decisions are built into those technologies in a recent paper, which I can share in the chat.
We can also ask about what were biases in architecture, and architects first starting to use Photoshop, and culture starting to become more visual in 2000, right? I think it was Benjamin Bratton who mentioned in the mid-2000s that the architects are just not designing buildings for people, but designing images which could look good, right? On a small scale on a blog. So Photoshop, he said Photoshop, I remember he told me Photoshop is the most important tool in architecture, and I was kind of shocked when it was 2005. So in a way, on one hand, we want all the students to play with Midjourney. On the other hand, I would like to forbid it. So we don't think about visual, right? We have to think about, so we want them to think about spatial, want to think about sustainability, want them to think about how it's going to feel for a person to be inside the building, as opposed to something which looks good in the picture. So from that respect, like, right, our excitement about these tools is also a very particular visual bias for architecture, which can have good parts, but also very, perhaps, potentially negative effects.
We need to squeeze in a few. Deepti, can I just say thank you for your question? Just to say that Deepti was the first person to have an exhibition on AI-generated architecture, I guess, in India. So we're reaching all over the world today. It's great. We've got a question for the chat from someone called Rifi, which is actually a good question, very straightforward in some way. What are your thoughts of there eventually being more AI than human images on the internet, prompting a feedback loop where AIs feed themselves?
I think if it makes the models degrade, then people are going to figure out how to train the models to filter out those images.
Lev, do you want to comment on
that? I think there's a bias in this panel which allows me to talk too much, and so I'm very sorry. Well, I think I agree with Aaron. You know, is that there are enough kind of people who understand these issues, and but right now, right, you know, to train a model which GPT-3 or model or stable diffusion, it is quite expensive. We're talking about, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. But one thing we know is that Moore's law is still not dead, or something like this. So it will become cheaper, and then, you know, people will be, as I said, more sensitive, and more people will be, right. You know, right now, if I want to train a network on my own data set, like, I know I have to commit quite, you know, weeks of time to learn how to do it, and I think eventually it will become maybe as easy as Photoshop, which still requires time, right? So I'm looking forward to the interfaces to creating, building, retraining these models becoming easier. I think it will happen. And then I think, you know, when we can have like maybe more interesting conversation or another conversation. So I hope it's the future.
But Aaron, just what you're saying then, if you can eradicate, you could also eradicate bias on that basis, right? I mean, hopefully, this is a system that could be recalibrated. Well,
I don't think that there's such a thing as eradicating bias. I think you can adjust the bias in different ways. But, you know, what you see as being sort of unbiased here is not, you can be unbiased in a different country or cultural context. And maybe we don't want to eliminate, but maybe we want to adjust biases to be more like the society we want versus the society we have. And there's various technical ways to make these kinds of adjustments, but they're all choices. Okay.
We've got a question in the chat. This is the final one, so we're going to need to wrap things up. This is fantastic, but we can maybe continue at another occasion, because it's been really great. Thank you so much, guys. Bill Seaman has got a question that comes from YouTube. Can AI define aesthetic preferences and be aware of a meta level of how those preferences are informed? Can we define a new form of self-aware computational intuition? Can AI define aesthetic preferences and be aware of a meta level of how those preferences are informed? Can we define a new form of self-aware computational intuition? Well, I think it's possible, but, you know, we don't need to, you know, it doesn't mean it has to become conscious. We just have to build, you know, think about GAN, right? Where like one network is generating things, another network is evaluating them. So maybe it's possible to build something like this to like add another, you know, another network, another layer to diffusion models. And this is where cultural analytics would come in, right? So we would need to do large-scale study, which is possible, to figure out what images are popular in culture today, like what are these Hollywood video games, concept art images, you know, and then, you know, you can kind of add this level so the system would kind of check and, you know, would give you more of these images or would give you less of these images, or would simply blur these images to prevent you from making them. So I think it's possible to do computationally. You know, I mean, even now you don't even need networks. You can have deterministic algorithms, and actually it would be great to have like one version of a system like that.
Yeah, I don't like. Yeah, go ahead.
No. Yeah.
I don't like the word aware, because it implies consciousness and intelligence and autonomy that these systems don't have. They're really statistical data fitting tools. And so we can use them to fit predictive models of aesthetics that will find patterns in data and make some, fit mathematical functions and predict people's choices with some accuracy, and they'll make some mistakes and they won't know about the cultural context of the art so they can't appreciate that aspect of it. And we could also use these to attempt to identify patterns in data and then form our hypotheses using these algorithms. And both, I think, are ways that these tools can inform and help us, develop tools for aesthetics.
So this has been a fantastic conversation. I just want to kind of say that there's a comment in the chat from Deep T about Lev's comment about the competition in China being judged by AI. I mean, that mind-blowing in some ways, because I'm just telling you, my students are using AI to generate the things, and I could be using AI to grade their essays. I mean, I should also say that another aspect of that was something that came up last week with Wan Yu He, who was being asked, she's a CEO of XCool. She was asked to use their AI software to check the competition entries. Now that is astonishing, right? It's astonishing. And you think, well, if it can check the competition entries, then the next step is just to do them in the first place, right? I mean, because you understand performance concerns, therefore you can use it in some way. I'm not quite sure where that leaves competitions, but you can do that. But that is a whole new Pandora's box of issues that it's raised. And I think today we've really, opened up a whole Pandora's box of questions. It's been a fabulous conversation. This is exactly, I think, what the platform is for, to bring everyone around the world together, not just Deep T in India, but Harith from Bangladesh and Vasco Harith in Iraq and Vasco in Bangladesh, to bring everyone together and to enjoy this. It's really been an incredibly enjoyable event. So thank you guys. Vasco, do you want to say one final word since I mentioned you? Can you want to maybe say something from Bangladesh? Or maybe not. Or can you hear? Yeah. No, they haven't the sound. Okay. Anyway, but it's been fantastic. To be continued. I mean, I think what's happening is that we are thinking on the fly as Vasco? Thinking on the fly, and new things are happening all the time. This is very much history in the making, and to have this feedback from such informed contributors today has really been a fantastic contribution to the debate itself. So this will be put up onto YouTube. Just a reminder that that the date for the submission for the conference in Digital Futures conference in the summer has been put back to 29th of November. And I mentioned earlier on about the FIU DDes to scholarships on offer.
Can you say a couple of words about this conference, because for people who don't know, just 2 words.
Yeah, maybe I could just share my screen.
Just share the link. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Let me just. I need to just.
More people know about
it. I think this is the thing. Okay, I've got to go backwards. Hold on a second. Yeah, here we are. I'll go backwards. Can't skip out for some reason. Yeah. Sorry, this one here. Now, hold on a second. I can't see what I put up here. But yeah, at the bottom here, if you just go to this link at the bottom, digitalfutures.international/conference, it'll give you the details of that. I'm not sure if we've updated the website, but the 29th of November is the submission deadline. Absolutely, completely free. I mean, this is a great conference. No registration fee, and published in Springer. And then just to simply say, this one is a bit of a nightmare. I'm sorry, because the link is too long there. But maybe if you just emailed Diana Bogosian, bbogosia@fiu.edu, she could take you directly to that, because it's difficult to put the link on a PowerPoint presentation. But so yes, okay, so fabulous. And next Sunday we have the last session of the series where we're looking at cities. This is something to be continued, because this was such a fabulous conversation, and I'm great to have brought together Lev and Aaron, 2 fantastic figures in their own right, and it's been fantastic. And I want to do a shout out also to Weidi for her beautiful contribution, and I look forward to next week. So thank you, everyone, and See you again soon. Thank you. Thank you.